Across more than 3,000 years of unbroken worship, the divine assembly known as the Anunnaki would receive the prayers of humanity's first city builders, preside over the rise and collapse of empires that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, inspire the creation of literature that would shape every subsequent civilization's understanding of gods and mortals, establish theological frameworks that would echo through Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and leave behind a legacy so profound that their names would resurface in the modern world as subjects of both scholarly fascination and fringe speculation about the origins of human civilization itself. But in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, when the first reed structures began to cluster along the banks of the lower Euphrates River, no observer could have predicted that the local deities worshipped by farmers and fishermen in the marshlands of southern Iraq would become the most influential divine pantheon in the ancient world, their stories serving as templates for flood narratives, creation myths, and descent into the underworld journeys that would be retold and reimagined for millennia after the last cuneiform tablet had crumbled to dust. This is the story of the Anunnaki, the great gods of ancient Mesopotamia, from their emergence in the religious consciousness of the Sumerians, who built humanity's first cities in the fertile plain between two rivers, through their transformation under the Akkadians who unified the region under history's first empire, their elevation to cosmic significance in the Babylonian creation epic that explained how the universe came to be, their preservation in the vast libraries of the Assyrian kings who collected the wisdom of centuries, and their eventual disappearance as Mesopotamian civilization yielded to Persian conquest and Greek cultural influence, leaving behind only the silent ziggurats that still rise from the Iraqi desert as monuments to gods who once seemed to rule the entire known world. The world into which the Anunnaki emerged was unlike anything that had existed before in human experience. The lower Mesopotamian plain, that great alluvial fan deposited over millennia by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as they slowed and spread before reaching the Persian Gulf, presented both unprecedented opportunity and unforgiving challenge to the human populations who migrated there during the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era. The soil was extraordinarily fertile, renewed each year by the silt carried down from the mountains of eastern Anatolia, but rainfall was insufficient for agriculture, meaning that successful cultivation required the construction and maintenance of irrigation canals that could direct river water to fields that might otherwise receive no moisture for months at a time. This fundamental environmental condition, the necessity of large-scale cooperative water management, created pressures towards social organisation that would ultimately produce the world's first cities, the world's first writing system, and the world's first systematic theology. The geographical setting of southern Mesopotamia, which the ancient inhabitants called Sumer and which modern scholars designate as the Sumerian heartland, consisted of a flat plain punctuated by marshes, river channels, and date palm groves, a landscape almost entirely lacking in the stone, timber and metal that other ancient civilizations took for granted. The inhabitants built their homes and temples from sun-dried mud brick, fashioned tools from clay and bitumen, and wove structures from the abundant reeds that grew in the marshes along the rivers and the shores of the Persian Gulf. This material poverty in certain resources combined with agricultural abundance in others created the conditions for long-distance trade, as the communities of the lower plain exchanged their surplus grain, dates, and textiles for the copper, timber, and precious stones they could not produce locally. The trading networks that developed during the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3100 before the Common Era, extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and from the highlands of Iran to the Nile Delta, creating webs of contact and exchange that would carry not only goods, but ideas, technologies, and religious concepts across vast distances. The people who created this civilization, whom modern scholars call the Sumerians based on later Akkadian designations, spoke a language that remains linguistically isolated, unrelated to any other known language family, either ancient or modern. This linguistic uniqueness has generated centuries of speculation about Sumerian origins, with theories ranging from migration from the Iranian highlands to indigenous development from earlier Neolithic populations in the region. But no scholarly consensus has emerged regarding where the Sumerians came from or how their distinctive language developed. What is certain is that by the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the Sumerian-speaking populations of southern Mesopotamia had developed a civilization of unprecedented complexity. characterized by urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental architecture in the form of towering temple platforms, sophisticated administrative systems utilizing clay tablets and cylinder seals, and a religious worldview that understood the universe as governed by a pantheon of anthropomorphic deities whose relationships and conflicts explained everything, from the annual flooding of the rivers to the outcome of military campaigns. The Sumerian religious worldview that gave birth to the concept of the Anunnaki rested on several foundational assumptions that shaped how these ancient people understood their place in the cosmos. The gods were understood to be anthropomorphic beings, possessing human forms and human emotions but differing from mortals in their immortality, their power over natural forces, and their requirement for human service. Each major god was associated with a particular city, residing in a temple at the centre of that urban community, and receiving daily offerings of food, drink and praise from the temple personnel who served as the deity's household staff. The temple was not a place of congregational worship in the modern sense, but rather the earthly residence of the god, complete with kitchens, bedrooms, courtyards and storerooms, all organised to meet the needs of a divine lord or lady whose physical presence was believed to inhabit the cult statue housed in the innermost sanctuary. Human beings, in this theological framework, existed to serve the gods, having been created specifically for the purpose of providing the labour and worship that the gods themselves had grown weary of performing. The term Anunnaki itself appears in Sumerian texts as a collective designation for the great gods, though the precise meaning and scope of the term evolved considerably over the 3 millennia during which it remained in use. The most common etymological interpretation derives the name from the Sumerian words for princely offspring, or seed of the prince, suggesting that the Anunnaki were understood as the royal descendants of the primordial divine couple, the sky god An and the earth goddess Ki, whose union produced the younger generation of deities who would actually govern the cosmos. In the earliest Sumerian religious texts, the Anunnaki function as a divine assembly, a council of gods who gather to make decisions affecting both the divine and human realms, deliberating on matters of cosmic significance, and issuing decrees that even the most powerful individual deities must respect. This conciliar structure reflected the political organization of early Sumerian society, in which major decisions were made by assemblies of elders rather than by autocratic rulers, suggesting that the Sumerians projected their own social arrangements onto the heavens and understood divine governance as operating according to familiar political principles. The principal members of the Anunnaki, those gods who appear most frequently in Sumerian religious texts and who received the most elaborate temple complexes and the most fervent worship, included a core group of deities whose names and attributes would remain recognizable throughout the entire 3,000-year span of Mesopotamian civilization. An, the sky god, occupied the highest position in the divine hierarchy, serving as the ultimate source of divine authority, even though he rarely intervened directly in cosmic or human affairs, preferring to delegate actual governance to younger and more active deities. His primary cult centre was the city of Uruk, where he shared temple space with his daughter or granddaughter Inanna, the goddess of love, war and the planet Venus, who would become one of the most widely worshipped and frequently invoked deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Enlil, the god of wind and air, served as the effective chief executive of the divine assembly, wielding the authority that An possessed but did not exercise, and his cult centre at Nippur became the religious capital of Sumer, the site where kingship was legitimated and where the most important religious festivals were celebrated. Enki, the god of freshwater, wisdom, and magic, presided over the Abzu, the freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the Earth's surface, and his cult centre at Eridu, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in southern Mesopotamia, claimed precedence as the first city where kingship had descended from heaven. Nanna, the moon god, received worship at the great temple complex of Ur, whose ziggurats and surrounding structures remain among the best preserved examples of Sumerian monumental architecture. Utu, the sun god and the deity of justice, rose each morning from the mountains of the east and traversed the sky before descending each evening into the underworld, where he served as judge of the dead alongside his sister Inanna's dark counterpart Ereshkigal, queen of the land of no return. The theological system that organized these deities into a coherent pantheon assigned each god a specific domain of authority. a numerical rank within the divine hierarchy, and a constellation of attributes, symbols, and mythological associations that distinguished them from other members of the assembly. Anu, as the sky god was known in Akkadian, held the supreme rank of 60, the highest number in the sexagesimal counting system that the Sumerians had developed, and that persists in our modern division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Enlil held the rank of 50, Enki the rank of 40, and other major deities received numerical designations that established their relative positions within the divine order. Each deity was associated with particular animals, particular celestial bodies, particular natural phenomena, and particular aspects of human experience, creating an elaborate symbolic vocabulary that allowed worshippers to recognize divine presence and divine will throughout the natural and social world. The gods were not abstractions or philosophical principles, but personalities, each with distinctive temperament, preferences, and modes of interaction with both divine peers and human supplicants, and the extensive mythological literature that has survived from ancient Mesopotamia reveals deities who quarrel, scheme, seduce, rage, mourn, celebrate, and otherwise behave in ways that any human observer would find immediately recognizable. The physical infrastructure of Anunnaki worship centered on the temple complexes that dominated the urban landscape of every major Sumerian city. The temple was understood not merely as a building where worship occurred, but as the actual house of the god, the place where the deity resided when present on earth, and from which divine blessing and protection radiated outward to encompass the entire city and its surrounding agricultural territories. The architectural centerpiece of the temple complex was the ziggurat, the stepped temple tower that has become the most iconic visual symbol of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, a massive structure of solid mud brick that rose in stages toward the sky, with each successive level smaller than the one below, creating the distinctive stepped profile that would later influence the design of pyramidal structures from Egypt to Mesoamerica. The ziggurat was not hollow, containing no interior chambers or spaces, but served as an elevated platform atop which the actual temple building stood, raising the dwelling place of the god above the flat plain and creating a visual axis connecting earth to heaven. The ascent of the ziggurat, typically accomplished by means of exterior staircases that climbed the structure's face or spiraled around its perimeter, was restricted to priests and temple personnel, with ordinary worshippers remaining at ground level in the courtyards and subsidiary buildings that surrounded the great tower. The temple complex itself constituted a substantial portion of the urban landscape, often occupying the highest ground in the city and commanding views across the surrounding plain, and the economic activities conducted within temple precincts made these religious institutions major players in the Sumerian economy. Temple lands extended throughout the agricultural hinterland of the city, worked by tenant farmers and dependent labourers whose surplus production flowed into temple storerooms. Temple workshops employed craftsmen who produced textiles, pottery, metalwork and other goods both for divine use and for exchange in commercial networks. Temple herds of cattle, sheep and goats provided meat, dairy products, wool and hides that supplemented the grain-based economy of the plain. The administrative records kept by temple scribes, impressed into clay tablets using the wedge-shaped stylus marks that give cuneiform its name, constitute the bulk of our surviving documentary evidence for early Sumerian society and reveal institutions of remarkable organizational sophistication, capable of tracking thousands of workers, tens of thousands of animals, and hundreds of thousands of units of barley, wool, and other commodities across multiple years and multiple administrative divisions. The ritual life of the temple unfolded according to calendrical cycles that structured the Sumerian year around agricultural activities and astronomical events, with major festivals marking the points at which divine intervention was most needed and most efficacious. The care of the cult statue, the image in which the god's presence was believed to reside, required daily attention from temple personnel who prepared meals, changed garments, provided entertainment, and otherwise attended to the needs of a divine lord or lady who experienced the full range of physical and emotional requirements that any anthropomorphic being would possess. The meals prepared for the gods were elaborate affairs, featuring multiple courses of bread, meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, beer, wine, and other delicacies, laid out on tables before the cult statue according to protocols that varied by deity and by occasion but always emphasized abundance, variety, and the finest quality of every ingredient. The garments in which the cult statues were dressed were renewed seasonally, with winter and summer wardrobes appropriate to the temperature, and with festival garments of exceptional elaboration reserved for major ritual occasions. Musical performances, recitations of hymns and prayers, the burning of incense, the pouring of libations, and the conduct of divination procedures all contributed to a ritual environment designed to please and propitiate deities whose favour was essential to the prosperity and security of the city and its people. The mythology of the Anunnaki, the stories that explain their origins, their relationships, their conflicts, and their interventions in human affairs, survives in a substantial body of literary texts inscribed on clay tablets and recovered by archaeological excavation beginning in the 19th century of the Common Era. These texts, composed originally in Sumerian and later translated, adapted and expanded in Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian versions, constitute the oldest religious literature in human history and established narrative templates that would be adapted consciously or unconsciously by virtually every subsequent civilization that encountered them. The creation of the cosmos, the organization of divine society, the origins of humanity, the relationship between gods and mortals, the nature of death and what follows it, the possibility of immortality and the reasons for its denial to human beings, the catastrophic flood that nearly ended all life and the survival of those who escaped it. These are the themes that Mesopotamian mythology explored with sophistication and emotional depth, and these are the themes that would recur in the religious and literary traditions of Greece, Rome, Israel, and every other civilization that inherited the intellectual legacy of the ancient Near East. The cosmogonic traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, those myths that explained how the universe came into being and how it achieved its present organization, varied considerably across different periods and different cities, but certain fundamental elements remained consistent throughout the long history of Mesopotamian religious thought. The primordial state, before the emergence of the gods and before the differentiation of heaven and earth, was understood as a watery chaos, an undifferentiated mass in which the elements that would later constitute the ordered cosmos existed in potential, but not yet in actuality. The emergence of the gods from this primordial water, the separation of heaven from earth, the establishment of the celestial bodies in their courses, the creation of the terrestrial landscape with its mountains, rivers and seas, the generation of plant and animal life, and finally, the fashioning of human beings to serve the gods. This sequence of cosmogonic events appears in various forms across the full span of Mesopotamian religious literature, though the specific agents and mechanisms of creation differ significantly between Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian versions. The Sumerian cosmogonic tradition understood Enki, the personified heaven and earth, as having been originally joined together in an undifferentiated state, their separation accomplished by Enlil, the god of air, who occupied the space between them and pushed them apart to create the vertical dimension of the cosmos. Once separated, and claimed dominion over the upper regions, while Ki or her later manifestations claimed dominion over the terrestrial realm, and the space between them became the atmosphere where Enlil exercised his authority over winds, storms, and weather phenomena. The organization of the cosmos required the establishment of the celestial bodies, with the sun and moon assigned their courses, and the stars arranged in constellations that would serve both as markers of seasonal time and as vehicles for divine communication with the human world through the science of celestial divination. The terrestrial landscape received its characteristic features through divine creative activity, with Enlil's pickaxe breaking through the Earth's surface at Nippur to allow the first humans to emerge, while Enki filled the rivers with water and the marshes with fish and reeds, and established the arts of agriculture, animal husbandry, and irrigation that would make human civilization possible. The creation of humanity occupies a central position in Mesopotamian mythological tradition, though the specific narratives that explain human origins vary considerably in their details while maintaining consistent themes regarding the purpose for which human beings were created and their relationship to the divine world. The most extensive Sumerian account of human origins appears in a myth known to modern scholars as Enki and Ninmah, which describes a divine crisis precipitated by the discontent of the lesser gods, those divine beings who occupied the lowest ranks of the celestial hierarchy and who were required to perform the manual labour necessary to maintain both the divine household and the cosmic order. These labouring gods, burdened with the endless tasks of digging canals, cultivating fields, and processing the agricultural produce that fed the great gods, eventually protested their condition, threatening to cease work unless their burden was relieved. Enki, the wise god of the freshwater deep, proposed a solution that would transform the theological status of labour and establish the fundamental relationship between gods and mortals that would define Mesopotamian religion for the next 3 millennia. The creation of the first human beings, according to this narrative tradition, required the combination of 2 essential elements, clay from the earth and divine essence in the form of blood from a slain god. The clay provided the physical substance of the human form, while the divine blood imparted the spark of consciousness and the capacity for intelligent action that would enable human beings to perform the tasks previously assigned to the lesser gods. The goddess Ninmah, working in cooperation with Enki and with the birth goddesses who assisted in the creative process, fashioned the first humans from this mixture of earthly and divine material, producing beings who combined mortal limitations with sufficient divine heritage to serve effectively as the servants of the gods. The purpose of human existence in this theological framework was service, the performance of the agricultural and ritual labour that the gods required but no longer wished to perform themselves, and this understanding of human purpose permeated every aspect of Mesopotamian religious practice, from the daily offerings presented at temple altars to the royal inscriptions that credited military victories to divine patronage and presented conquering kings as faithful servants of their divine lords. The mythological traditions surrounding Inanna, the goddess of love and war who would become one of the most complex and frequently invoked deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, illustrate the sophistication and emotional depth that Sumerian religious literature could achieve, while also demonstrating the theological concepts that organized Anunnaki thought regarding death, the underworld, and the boundaries that separated the divine and human realms. The myth known as the Descent of Inanna describes the goddess's journey from heaven to the underworld, the realm of the dead ruled by her dark sister Ereshkigal, a journey undertaken for reasons that remain somewhat ambiguous in the surviving texts, but that apparently involved Inanna's desire to extend her power even into the realm that was not rightfully hers. The underworld in Mesopotamian cosmology was understood as a dark, dusty, joyless realm beneath the Earth's surface, a place where the dead existed in a diminished and shadowy state, consuming dust and clay rather than proper food, and from which there was no return once one had entered its gates and consumed its hospitality. Inanna's descent required her to pass through 7 gates, at each of which she was required to remove one item of her royal regalia, the crown, the jewellery, the garments, and the insignia of divine power that identified her as Queen of Heaven and Mistress of Cosmic Authority. By the time she reached the throne room of Ereshkigal, Inanna had been stripped of all her divine attributes and appeared naked and powerless before her sister, who struck her dead and hung her corpse on a hook in the wall like a piece of meat drying in a slaughterhouse. The death of Inanna created a cosmic crisis, for with the goddess of love and fertility absent from the upper world, all reproduction ceased, both human and animal, threatening the continuation of life itself. The intervention of Enki, who fashioned creatures capable of entering the underworld and reviving Inanna with the food and water of life, eventually secured her resurrection, but the laws of the underworld demanded that someone else take her place, that a substitute be found to occupy the position she was vacating. Inanna's return to the upper world and her selection of her husband Dumuzi as the substitute who would descend in her place established mythological themes of death and resurrection, divine suffering and return that would echo through subsequent religious traditions far removed from the marshlands of southern Iraq. The flood narrative that appears in Mesopotamian literature represents perhaps the most significant mythological contribution of the Anunnaki tradition to subsequent religious thought, for the story of a divinely ordained deluge that destroys humanity, except for one righteous survivor who preserves life in a boat, predates the biblical flood narrative by more than 1,000 years, and almost certainly served as the source from which the Hebrew version was adapted. The Sumerian flood story survives in fragmentary form, but the Akkadian and Babylonian versions preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Atrahasis myth provide extensive accounts of the divine decision to destroy humanity, the warning given to a single mortal, the construction of a survival vessel, the flood itself, and the eventual restoration of normal cosmic order after the waters receded. The reasons given for the divine decision to send the flood vary across different versions of the myth, with the Atrahasis tradition emphasizing human population growth and noise that disturbed the gods' sleep, while other versions suggest divine dissatisfaction with human behavior, or simply the arbitrary exercise of divine power without moral justification. The warning to the flood hero, whether called Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, or Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, came from Enki, the wise god who had created humanity in the first place, and who felt a certain responsibility for the beings he had fashioned, a responsibility that overrode the collective decision of the divine assembly to eliminate the human population entirely. The construction of the survival vessel, the gathering of animals and family members, the sealing of the vessel with bitumen, the rising of the floodwaters, the duration of the inundation, the landing of the vessel on a mountain after the waters receded, the sending forth of birds to determine whether dry land had appeared, the emergence of the survivors and their offering of sacrifice to the gods, the divine acceptance of the sacrifice and the establishment of a new covenant between gods and mortals. These narrative elements appear in the Mesopotamian flood traditions with such specificity and in such consistent sequence that their relationship to the later biblical account cannot be coincidental. The discovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative by the British Museum's George Smith in 1872, and his recognition that it represented a parallel to the biblical Genesis story, created a sensation in Victorian intellectual circles and initiated the scholarly investigation of biblical Mesopotamian relationships that continues to the present day. The Anunnaki, through their mythological traditions, had shaped not only Mesopotamian religious consciousness, but the religious consciousness of civilizations that emerged centuries after the last Sumerian scribe had pressed his stylus into wet clay. The political history of ancient Mesopotamia, the rise and fall of empires that succeeded one another across more than 2 millennia, provides the institutional and cultural context within which the worship of the Anunnaki evolved, transformed, and eventually disappeared. The Sumerian city-states of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, politically independent urban centres that competed with one another for regional hegemony, while sharing a common language, culture, and religious tradition, gave way around 2334 to the first empire in human history, the Akkadian Empire founded by Sargon of Akkad, a Semitic-speaking ruler whose conquests unified Mesopotamia under a single political authority for the first time, and whose dynasty maintained power for approximately a century and a half. The Akkadians, speakers of a language related to later Hebrew, Arabic, and other Semitic tongues, adapted Sumerian religious institutions to their own purposes, identifying their Semitic deities with Sumerian counterparts, and continuing the temple traditions that had developed over the previous millennium, while simultaneously elevating the status of their own ethnic patron deities within the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. The transformation of the Anunnaki under Akkadian influence involved both the Semitization of divine names and the modification of theological relationships to reflect new political realities. Inanna became Ishtar. Her attributes expanded and her cult extended throughout the empire, and became Anu, retaining his position as supreme sky god, but sharing his authority more explicitly with the newly elevated deities of the Akkadian conquerors. The Akkadian period also witnessed the emergence of new literary forms, including hymns composed in Akkadian rather than Sumerian, and royal inscriptions that credited Akkadian military success to the favour of both traditional Sumerian deities and the ethnic patron deities of the conquering population. The integration of Sumerian and Akkadian religious traditions created a hybrid theological system that would provide the foundation for all subsequent Mesopotamian religious development, though the specific balance between Sumerian preservation and Akkadian innovation varied across different periods and different political contexts. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2154 initiated a period of political fragmentation during which the traditional Sumerian city-states reasserted their independence and attempted to revive the cultural and religious traditions that had preceded Akkadian unification. The third dynasty of Ur, founded around 2112 by Ur-Nammu, achieved the reunification of southern Mesopotamia under Sumerian political and cultural leadership, and this period, often called the Sumerian Renaissance or the Neo-Sumerian period, witnessed an extraordinary flourishing of temple construction, literary production, and religious systematization that has provided modern scholars with some of the most important sources for understanding Sumerian religious thought. The ziggurat of Ur, partially reconstructed by archaeologists and still standing in the Iraqi desert, dates from this period and represents the best preserved example of the monumental temple architecture that characterized Anunnaki worship at its height. The administrative archives preserved from the Ur-3 period document temple organization, ritual practice, and economic activity with unprecedented detail, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct the daily rhythms of religious life in ways that earlier and later periods rarely permit. The fall of the Ur-3 dynasty around 2004, accomplished by the combined forces of the Elamites from the Iranian highlands and the Amorites from the Syrian steppes, initiated another period of political fragmentation that would last for approximately 3 centuries before the rise of Babylon under Hammurabi around 1792 established new patterns of political and religious organization that would persist, with modifications for the remainder of Mesopotamian history. The Amorites, like the Akkadians before them, were speakers of a Semitic language who adopted and adapted the religious traditions they found in southern Mesopotamia, identifying their own deities with established members of the Anunnaki, and contributing new theological concepts that reflected their own cultural background. The city of Babylon, which had existed as a minor settlement during the Sumerian and Akkadian periods, rose to political prominence under Amorite leadership and became the religious and cultural capital of a new Mesopotamian synthesis that would bear the name Babylonian throughout subsequent history. The elevation of Babylon from provincial obscurity to imperial magnificence brought with it a corresponding transformation in the theological status of the city's patron deity, Marduk, whose rise from minor local god to supreme ruler of the Mesopotamian pantheon represents one of the most dramatic examples of religious innovation in ancient history. The process by which Marduk achieved this unprecedented position unfolded across several centuries and involved the systematic rewriting of Mesopotamian cosmology to place Babylon and its god at the centre of the universe, a theological project that reached its fullest expression in the composition of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that would become the foundational text of Mesopotamian religion for the remainder of its existence. The Enuma Elish, whose title derives from its opening words meaning when on high, presents a radically different cosmogonic narrative from the earlier Sumerian accounts that had placed Enlil and the traditional Anunnaki at the centre of creation. In this new version, the primordial waters are personified as 2 divine beings, Apsu the fresh water and Tiamat the salt water, whose mingling produces successive generations of younger gods, whose noise and activity eventually provokes Apsu to plan their destruction. The younger gods, learning of this threat, dispatch Apsu through the cunning of Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, but this victory only intensifies the cosmic conflict as Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, assembles an army of monstrous creatures to avenge him and destroy the younger gods entirely. The terror that Tiamat's preparations inspire among the gods creates the narrative space for Marduk's elevation, as none of the traditional deities prove willing to face her in battle. Anu attempts to confront Tiamat, but retreats in fear. He, despite his earlier triumph over Apsu, declines to challenge the primordial mother. The assembly of the Anunnaki falls into despair as each traditional champion proves inadequate to the cosmic threat. Into this vacuum steps Marduk, described in the epic as the son of Ea, possessed of extraordinary physical beauty and supernatural power, but as yet unproven in cosmic governance. Marduk agrees to face Tiamat on behalf of the assembled gods, but his willingness comes with a price that transforms the entire structure of divine authority. Before he will undertake the battle, Marduk demands that the Anunnaki grant him supreme and permanent kingship over all the gods, the power to determine destinies that had previously belonged to the collective assembly, and the right to have his decrees stand unchallenged and unalterable forever. The desperation of the Anunnaki leads them to accept these unprecedented conditions, and in a dramatic assembly scene that echoes the political processes of Mesopotamian city-states, they formally invest Marduk with absolute sovereignty, testing his new powers by having him destroy and then recreate a constellation before their eyes. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat that follows represents one of the most vivid combat narratives in ancient literature, though even here the scholarly conventions of Mesopotamian composition maintain a certain measured distance from the violence being described. Armed with the 4 winds as weapons and accompanied by a storm chariot, Marduk advances against Tiamat and her army of monsters. The confrontation reaches its climax when Marduk catches Tiamat in a net, inflates her body with the winds until she cannot close her mouth, and then shoots an arrow through her open maw into her heart. The primordial mother of chaos, whose power had terrified the entire assembly of gods, falls before the young champion of Babylon, and from her divided corpse Marduk fashions the physical structure of the universe. Her upper half becomes the sky, fixed in place by a bar that prevents the waters above from flooding the earth. Her lower half becomes the earth itself, with the Tigris and Euphrates flowing from her eyes and the mountains rising from her breasts. The zodiacal constellations that govern the calendar are established in their courses, and the moon receives its monthly cycle of waxing and waning. The entire cosmos, in the Babylonian formulation, exists as a monument to Marduk's victory, and a testimony to the supreme power that the Anunnaki had granted him in their moment of need. The creation of humanity in the Enuma Elish follows logically from the establishment of cosmic order, though the specific mechanism differs somewhat from the earlier Sumerian accounts while preserving their essential theological function. Marduk, observing that the gods still labour under the burden of maintaining the cosmic order, conceives a plan to create a substitute workforce. The blood of Kingu, Tiamat's general and the leader of her monstrous army, provides the divine substance from which humanity is fashioned, a choice that simultaneously punishes the cosmic rebel and explains the mortal nature of human existence through its derivation from a defeated and executed deity. The grateful gods, relieved of their labours by this new creation, express their gratitude to Marduk by building Babylon as his earthly dwelling place, constructing the Asargala temple and the great Ziggurat Etemenanki, whose name means the foundation of heaven and earth, and which later tradition identified with the biblical Tower of Babel. The epic concludes with a liturgical passage reciting the 50 names of Marduk, each name representing a divine attribute or power that had previously belonged to a different member of the Anunnaki, but which now concentrated in the supreme god of Babylon all the authorities and capacities of the entire pantheon. The theological revolution represented by the Enuma Elish did not eliminate the traditional Anunnaki from Mesopotamian religion, but rather subordinated them to a new hierarchical structure centered on Marduk's kingship. The older gods retained their temples, their cults, and their mythological identities, but their relationship to cosmic authority underwent fundamental transformation. Where the Sumerian assembly of the Anunnaki had governed through collective deliberation and the assignment of destinies to various deities, the Babylonian system concentrated ultimate power in a single supreme deity who delegated specific functions to subordinate divine beings. This monarchical model of divine governance reflected and reinforced the political developments of the Old Babylonian period, during which increasingly powerful kings consolidated authority over previously independent city-states and claimed divine sanction for their rule. The relationship between royal ideology and theological innovation during this period demonstrates the close integration of religious and political thought in ancient Mesopotamia, though the precise mechanisms by which new religious ideas emerged and gained acceptance remained subjects of scholarly debate. The reign of Hammurabi, which extended from approximately 1792 to 1750, represented the high point of the Old Babylonian period and established patterns of royal self-presentation that would influence Mesopotamian kingship for over a millennium. Hammurabi's famous law code, inscribed on a black diorite stele that French archaeologists discovered at Susa in 1901 and that now resides in the Louvre, presents the king as chosen by Anu and Enlil to establish justice in the land and protect the weak from the powerful. The iconography of the stele, which depicts Hammurabi receiving the symbols of justice from Shamash, the sun god and deity of judgment, illustrates the theological foundations of Babylonian royal authority, while simultaneously acknowledging the continued importance of traditional deities within the new hierarchical system. The legal provisions of the code, which address matters ranging from commercial transactions to family law to criminal penalties, reflect the social and economic conditions of the Old Babylonian period, while presenting themselves as divinely sanctioned regulations that the king had received from the gods and implemented for the benefit of his subjects. The temples of the Anunnaki continued to function as major economic and social institutions throughout Hammurabi's reign, receiving royal patronage and protection, while contributing to the administration of the kingdom through their extensive landholdings, their craft workshops, and their educational facilities. The centuries following Hammurabi's death witnessed the gradual decline of the Old Babylonian kingdom and the emergence of new political powers that would contest control of Mesopotamia throughout the second half of the second millennium. The Kassite dynasty, which originated in the Zagros Mountains to the east, and which gradually assumed control of Babylon during the 16th century, maintained the religious institutions and theological traditions that had developed under Amorite rule, while introducing certain innovations in temple administration and divine cult. The Kassite period, which lasted approximately 4 centuries, and which provided Mesopotamia with a degree of political stability unusual in its history, witnessed the continued elaboration of Babylonian religious literature and the codification of textual traditions that would be transmitted to later periods. The Great Omen series, which correlated celestial and terrestrial phenomena with predictions of future events, achieved their canonical forms during this period, as did many of the ritual and liturgical texts that govern temple practice. The relationship between the Kassites and traditional Babylonian religion has been characterized by scholars as one of assimilation rather than innovation, with the foreign rulers adopting the established cult of Marduk and the Anunnaki, rather than attempting to impose their own religious traditions on their subjects. The political landscape of the Late Bronze Age, from approximately 1550 to 1200, involved Kassite Babylon in a complex system of great power diplomacy that connected Mesopotamia with Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and various smaller kingdoms across the ancient Near East. The Amarna letters, a diplomatic archive discovered in Egypt and dating to the 14th century, preserve correspondence between the rulers of these great powers that reveals both the political relationships and the cultural exchanges that characterized the period. The temples of the Anunnaki played significant roles in this diplomatic system, as religious festivals provided occasions for royal gift exchanges, and divine statues served as diplomatic pledges and symbols of alliance. The movement of cult statues between kingdoms, whether as gifts or as spoils of war, represented matters of the highest significance in ancient Near Eastern thought, as the physical presence of a deity in a particular location conferred divine protection on that place and its ruler. The capture of Marduk's statue by Hittite or Elamite invaders, which occurred on several occasions during the Late Bronze Age, constituted a theological crisis of the first order, requiring elaborate rituals of recovery and purification when the statue was eventually returned to Babylon. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age international system around 1200, associated with the widespread disruptions attributed to the Sea Peoples and involving the fall of the Hittite Empire and the decline of Egyptian power, created new conditions in the ancient Near East that would eventually allow the emergence of Assyrian dominance over Mesopotamia. The Assyrians, speakers of a dialect of Akkadian who had inhabited the Upper Tigris region since at least the 3rd millennium, had developed their own religious traditions centered on the national god Ashur, whose name also designated the principal Assyrian city, and who combined attributes of several members of the traditional Anunnaki in a distinctive theological synthesis. The relationship between Ashur and the Babylonian pantheon represented one of the central theological problems of the Assyrian period, as Assyrian kings sought to legitimate their authority over both their traditional heartland and the conquered territories of southern Mesopotamia through religious ideologies that could accommodate both regional traditions. The solution that emerged over the course of the first millennium involved the identification of Ashur with the highest positions in the divine hierarchy, sometimes equating him with Anu as supreme sky god, sometimes with Enlil as king of the gods, and sometimes with Marduk as victor over cosmic chaos, depending on the political context and the theological purposes of particular compositions. The Assyrian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent during the Neo-Assyrian period, from approximately 934 to 609, when a succession of powerful kings extended Assyrian control from Egypt to the Persian Gulf and from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian highlands. The religious policies of the Neo-Assyrian kings combined respect for the traditional cults of conquered peoples with the promotion of Ashur as supreme deity of the empire and the systematic collection of religious and scholarly literature in the royal libraries at Nineveh. The library of Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to approximately 627 and who represented the last of the great Assyrian conquerors, contained thousands of cuneiform tablets covering virtually every branch of Mesopotamian learning, including the mythological, ritual, and divinatory texts that have provided modern scholars with their most comprehensive access to the religious traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. The scribes of Ashurbanipal's library copied and preserved texts dating back to the Sumerian period, creating archives that would survive the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the subsequent destruction of Nineveh, and that would be rediscovered by European archaeologists in the 19th century of the Common Era. The religious life of the Neo-Assyrian period involved elaborate ritual systems that sought to maintain cosmic order through the proper performance of temple ceremonies and the correct interpretation of divine signs. The Anunnaki received regular offerings according to calendars that specified the appropriate sacrifices for each day of the month and each phase of the astronomical cycle. The king himself played essential roles in certain religious ceremonies, acting as the intermediary between the divine and human realms and assuming responsibility for maintaining the cosmic balance through his ritual actions. The New Year festival, celebrated in the spring month of Nisanu, represented the most important annual ceremony in Mesopotamian religion, involving the ritual reenactment of the creation narrative, the renewal of the king's authority through divine investiture, and the determination of destinies for the coming year. The precise forms of this festival varied between Babylon, where Marduk occupied the central position, and the Assyrian heartland, where Ashur received corresponding honours, but the fundamental structure and theological significance remained consistent across regional variations. The divinatory practices of the Neo-Assyrian period achieved levels of sophistication and systematization that reflected centuries of accumulated observation and interpretation. The Omen series, which covered phenomena ranging from the movements of celestial bodies to the appearance of animal livers to the patterns of oil on water, provided comprehensive guides for interpreting the messages that the gods continuously sent to humanity through the natural world. The royal courts maintained staffs of specialized diviners who observed the heavens, examined sacrificial animals, and analyzed dreams to provide the king with guidance from the divine realm. The relationship between these divinatory practices and the theology of the Anunnaki involved the understanding that the gods had established the cosmos according to patterns that revealed their intentions to those trained to read the signs. The movements of the planets, understood as the visible manifestations of major deities, communicated divine purposes through their positions, conjunctions, and appearances. The liver of a sacrificial animal, shaped by divine influence at the moment of the animal's birth, contained messages specific to the question posed by the diviner. The entire universe, in this understanding, functioned as a communication system through which the Anunnaki expressed their will to the attentive observer. The fall of the Assyrian Empire, accomplished by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes between 614 and 609, transferred political dominance in Mesopotamia back to Babylon and initiated the final flowering of traditional Mesopotamian civilization under the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean dynasty. Nebuchadnezzar's son, who ruled from 604 to 562, and who figures prominently in biblical narratives as the destroyer of Jerusalem and the captor of the Judean exiles, represented the culmination of Babylonian royal power and the last great patron of traditional Mesopotamian religion. The building programs of Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into the magnificent city described by Greek historians, with its massive walls, its processional ways paved with coloured stones, its ziggurat at Enki rising to the heavens, and its hanging gardens that later traditions would count among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The cult of Marduk and the traditional Anunnaki received lavish royal support during this period, with temple reconstructions, elaborate offerings, and the maintenance of the ritual systems that had developed over the previous 2 millennia. The Babylonian priesthood preserved and transmitted the religious traditions that connected the Neo-Babylonian period with the Sumerian origins of Mesopotamian civilization, maintaining textual copies of ancient compositions and performing ceremonies whose origins lay in the 3rd millennium or earlier. The theological self-confidence of the Neo-Babylonian period, which presented Marduk and the Anunnaki as the supreme powers governing the universe, and Babylon as the centre of cosmic order, would face its definitive challenge in 539 when the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and incorporated Mesopotamia into the vast Achaemenid Empire that stretched from Egypt to Central Asia. The religious policies of the Persian conquerors differed significantly from those of previous Mesopotamian empires, as the Achaemenids followed Zoroastrian traditions that conceived of divinity in fundamentally different terms from the polytheistic systems of Mesopotamia. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, a cuneiform text discovered in Babylon in 1879 and now housed in the British Museum, presents the Persian conquest in terms acceptable to Babylonian religious sensibilities, claiming that Marduk himself had chosen Cyrus as his instrument and had delivered Babylon into his hands without battle. This accommodationist approach allowed the traditional temples to continue functioning, and the traditional cults to be maintained, but the political context within which these religious activities took place had fundamentally changed. The incorporation of Mesopotamia into the Persian Empire initiated a process of gradual transformation that would unfold across the subsequent centuries, affecting the role of the Anunnaki in ways that reflected the changed political and cultural circumstances of the region. The Persian kings, while tolerant of local religious traditions, did not participate in the traditional Mesopotamian royal rituals in the manner of native Babylonian monarchs, creating a discontinuity in the relationship between kingship and divine cult that had characterized Mesopotamian civilization since its earliest periods. The annual Akitu festival, which required the king to perform specific ritual actions in the presence of Marduk and to receive the god's confirmation of his royal authority, could not function in the same theological manner when the king was a Persian ruler who worshipped Ahura Mazda and who might not be present in Babylon to perform the required ceremonies. The priesthoods of the traditional temples continued their activities throughout the Achaemenid period, maintaining the daily offerings, preserving the textual traditions, and performing the ritual cycles that connected the present with the ancient past. But the cosmic significance that had attached to these activities, when they were integrated with the power of a native Mesopotamian monarch, was necessarily diminished by the changed political circumstances. The Babylonian scribal schools of the Achaemenid period continued to copy and transmit the ancient texts that preserved knowledge of the Anunnaki and their mythological traditions, demonstrating the persistence of learned culture even as the political framework within which that culture had developed underwent fundamental transformation. The astronomical observations that the Babylonian scholars conducted during this period achieved remarkable precision and mathematical sophistication, building upon centuries of accumulated data to develop predictive methods that allowed the calculation of planetary positions and lunar eclipses with considerable accuracy. These astronomical achievements, which represented the continued development of traditions that understood celestial phenomena as manifestations of divine activity, would later be transmitted to Greek and ultimately to Islamic and European science, forming one of the most significant legacies of Mesopotamian intellectual culture. The relationship between the astronomical traditions and the theology of the Anunnaki remained embedded in the terminology and conceptual frameworks employed by the Babylonian scholars, who continued to identify the planets with their traditional divine associations, even as their mathematical methods achieved levels of abstraction that transcended the mythological narratives from which those associations had originally derived. The conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great in the decade following 334 brought Mesopotamia under the rule of a Macedonian king whose cultural background derived from the Greek traditions that had developed in relative isolation from the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. The death of Alexander in Babylon in 323, following a brief illness that some ancient sources attributed to poisoning and others to the accumulated effects of his wounds and his legendary drinking, left his vast conquest to be divided among his generals, with Mesopotamia eventually falling under the control of Seleucus and his descendants, who would rule the region for approximately 2 centuries as the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid period witnessed significant cultural interactions between Greek and Mesopotamian traditions, as Greek settlers established communities throughout the region, and as the ruling class brought with them the religious traditions, philosophical schools, and artistic conventions of the Hellenistic world. The traditional temples of the Anunnaki continued to function during the Seleucid period, with the priesthoods maintaining their rituals and their textual traditions, even as the surrounding culture underwent significant transformation through contact with Greek influences. The Babylonian astronomical texts from the Seleucid period demonstrate the continued vitality of the scribal schools and their preservation of traditions that extended back through the Neo-Babylonian, Assyrian, and even earlier periods to the ancient Sumerian foundations of Mesopotamian learning. The cuneiform writing system, which had served as the medium for recording knowledge of the Anunnaki and their myths since the 3rd millennium, continued to be employed by the temple scribes even as Aramaic and eventually Greek became the dominant languages of administration and commerce in the region. The astronomical diaries maintained by the Babylonian scholars during the Seleucid period provide detailed records of celestial observations, weather phenomena, commodity prices, and political events that demonstrate the continued integration of cosmic observation with earthly concerns that had characterized Mesopotamian thought since its origins. The persistence of these traditions across the political transformations of the Achaemenid and Seleucid periods testified to the deep roots that the religious and intellectual systems associated with the Anunnaki had established within the institutional structures of Mesopotamian temple culture. The gradual decline of cuneiform literacy during the Seleucid and subsequent Parthian periods represented the beginning of the process by which direct knowledge of the Anunnaki and their myths would be lost to human memory for nearly 2 millennia. The temple schools that had maintained the scribal traditions found their recruitment increasingly limited as alternative educational pathways became available to ambitious young men, and as the economic and social circumstances that had supported the elaborate temple establishments underwent transformation in the changing political environment. The last dated cuneiform tablet currently known to scholars was written in 75 of the Common Era, approximately a century after the Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia had transferred political control of the region from the Hellenistic Seleucids to an Iranian dynasty with its own distinct cultural and religious traditions. The disappearance of cuneiform literacy meant that the vast textual corpus preserving knowledge of the Anunnaki, their myths, their rituals, and their role in human affairs became inaccessible to subsequent generations, who could see the wedge-shaped impressions on clay tablets without being able to read the messages they contained. The physical monuments of Mesopotamian religion, the ziggurats and temple complexes that had dominated the urban landscapes of the ancient cities, underwent gradual deterioration during the centuries following the end of cuneiform literacy, as the communities that had maintained them dispersed, and the knowledge required for their proper functioning was lost. The great ziggurat of Babylon, Enki, which had been restored and maintained by Nebuchadnezzar and his predecessors as the architectural centre of Marduk's cult, fell into ruin during the Parthian period, its mud brick construction vulnerable to the elements once the regular maintenance that had preserved it was discontinued. The processional ways, the temple precincts, and the urban infrastructure of the ancient cities gradually returned to the desert conditions from which they had originally been reclaimed, leaving only mounds of debris to mark the locations where the Anunnaki had once received the worship of millions of devotees across thousands of years of continuous religious tradition. The memory of the Anunnaki survived in fragmentary and distorted forms through references in Greek and Roman authors who had encountered Mesopotamian traditions during the Hellenistic period and had transmitted partial accounts of Babylonian religion to readers in the classical world. But the detailed knowledge of the mythological systems, the ritual practices, and the theological frameworks that had characterized Mesopotamian civilization was effectively lost. The biblical traditions that had developed in contact with Mesopotamian civilization preserved certain echoes of the ancient religious systems, though transformed through the lens of Israelite monotheism and adapted to serve the theological purposes of the biblical authors. The flood narrative preserved in the Book of Genesis, which scholars have long recognized as bearing structural and thematic similarities to the Mesopotamian flood traditions preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic, maintained within the Judeo-Christian scriptural tradition, a transformed version of a mythological pattern whose original expression had been associated with the Anunnaki and their decision to destroy and then preserve humanity. The Tower of Babel narrative, which the Book of Genesis locates in the plain of Shinar, and which describes a massive building project intended to reach the heavens, has been connected by scholars with the Mesopotamian ziggurat tradition, and specifically with the Temenanki, the great stepped temple of Marduk at Babylon, whose name means house of the foundation of heaven and earth. These biblical preservations of Mesopotamian themes ensured that certain elements of the ancient traditions would survive within the textual canons of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, though in forms so transformed from their original contexts that their Mesopotamian origins would not be recognized until the rediscovery of the cuneiform sources in the modern era. The physical landscape of ancient Mesopotamia presented to medieval and early modern observers a terrain of mounded ruins whose significance remained mysterious to those who lacked access to the textual traditions that could explain what the mounds contained. Arab geographers and travellers who passed through the region recorded the locations of ancient sites and transmitted local traditions about the ruins, but the systematic investigation of these sites would await the development of archaeological methods and the political circumstances that would make European exploration of the region possible. The biblical associations of the region, which connected the landscape with narratives familiar to European readers through their scriptural education, provided one framework for understanding the ruins, encouraging identification of specific sites with biblical locations mentioned in the accounts of the Babylonian exile and the conquests of Nebuchadnezzar. The ziggurats, rising as distinctive stepped formations above the flat terrain of southern Iraq, attracted particular attention and speculation, with various travellers and scholars proposing identifications with the Tower of Babel or with other structures mentioned in ancient sources. The decipherment of cuneiform writing in the 19th century represented one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era, unlocking a vast corpus of textual material that transformed understanding of ancient Near Eastern history, and that restored knowledge of the Anunnaki to human awareness after nearly 2,000 years of oblivion. The process of decipherment began with the trilingual inscriptions at Behistun in western Iran, where the Persian king Darius I had caused an account of his accession and conquest to be carved high on a cliff face, in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. The English officer Henry Rawlinson, working in the 1830s and 1840s under conditions of considerable physical danger, copied the inscriptions and contributed significantly to the effort to understand the cuneiform scripts, building upon earlier work by Georg Friedrich Grotefend and other scholars who had begun the process of identifying the values of cuneiform signs. The recognition that one of the scripts at Behistun represented a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic allowed scholars to apply their knowledge of these languages to the interpretation of the Babylonian cuneiform, gradually building up a working understanding of Akkadian grammar and vocabulary that permitted the reading of increasingly complex texts. The archaeological excavations that accompanied and followed the decipherment efforts brought to light the material remains of Mesopotamian civilization and provided the physical context within which the recovered texts could be understood. The excavations at Nineveh conducted by Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s and 1850s uncovered the palaces of the Assyrian kings and the library of Ashurbanipal, whose vast collection of cuneiform tablets included copies of literary, religious, scientific, and administrative texts that transformed scholarly understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture. The discovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh, recognised by George Smith in 1872 as containing a flood narrative strikingly parallel to the biblical account, created a sensation in Victorian England and demonstrated to the general public the significance of the cuneiform discoveries for understanding the ancient world from which the biblical traditions had emerged. The recognition that Mesopotamian literature contained versions of the flood story that predated the biblical account by more than a millennium raised profound questions about the relationship between the biblical narratives and the older Near Eastern traditions, questions that would occupy scholars and theologians through the remainder of the 19th century and into the 20th. The excavations at numerous sites throughout Iraq and Syria in the decades following Layard's work at Nineveh progressively revealed the extent and complexity of Mesopotamian civilization and provided the textual and material evidence that allowed scholars to reconstruct the religious systems centered on the Anunnaki. The German excavations at Babylon, conducted between 1899 and 1917 under the direction of Robert Coldaway, uncovered the architectural remains of Nebuchadnezzar's capital and provided physical evidence for the descriptions of the city preserved in ancient sources, though the ziggurat at Enki had been so thoroughly destroyed that only its foundations could be traced. The French excavations at Lagash and Tello brought to light the archives of the Sumerian city-states and the religious texts that documented the worship of the Anunnaki in the 3rd millennium, pushing the documented history of Mesopotamian religion back to periods far earlier than had previously been accessible. The discovery of the Sumerian language, distinct from the Semitic Akkadian and representing one of the oldest written languages in human history, revealed the ultimate origins of the traditions that had been transmitted through the Babylonian and Assyrian periods to the threshold of the Common Era. The systematic publication and analysis of the cuneiform texts recovered through archaeological excavation occupied generations of scholars who gradually built up comprehensive knowledge of the Anunnaki, their myths, and their role in Mesopotamian religious thought. The work of scholars including Samuel Noah Kramer, whose publications on Sumerian mythology beginning in the 1930s made the oldest Mesopotamian traditions accessible to general readers, established frameworks for understanding the religious systems that had governed Mesopotamian civilization for 3 millennia. The recognition of the developmental relationships connecting Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian religious traditions allowed scholars to trace the evolution of concepts and practices associated with the Anunnaki across the full span of Mesopotamian history, understanding how earlier traditions were adapted, transformed, and reinterpreted by successive generations of theologians and worshippers. The academic study of Assyriology, the field devoted to the investigation of the cuneiform cultures, developed sophisticated methodologies for interpreting the textual and material evidence and for reconstructing the historical context within which the religious traditions had functioned. The 20th century witnessed not only the continued scholarly investigation of the Anunnaki and their religious contexts, but also the emergence of alternative interpretations that departed dramatically from the conclusions reached by academic researchers. The publication in 1976 of Zecharia Sitchin's book The 12th Planet initiated a series of works that proposed a radically different understanding of the Anunnaki, identifying them not as the divine beings worshipped by ancient Mesopotamians within indigenous religious frameworks, but as extraterrestrial beings from a distant planet who had visited Earth in the remote past and whose activities had shaped human civilization. Sitchin, who claimed knowledge of ancient Sumerian and Akkadian, argued that the mythological text described real events involving technologically advanced beings whose spacecraft, genetic engineering capabilities, and political conflicts had been recorded by ancient observers who understood these phenomena in religious terms because they lacked the scientific frameworks necessary for accurate interpretation. The Anunnaki, in Sitchin's telling, came from a planet called Nibiru that orbits the Sun on an elliptical path requiring 3,600 years for completion, visiting Earth periodically and creating humanity through genetic manipulation to serve as workers in their mining operations. The ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki, though rejected by the scholarly community as based on misreadings of the cuneiform sources and unsupported by archaeological evidence, achieved considerable popular success and established a framework within which the Mesopotamian gods continue to figure in contemporary alternative culture. The books of Zecharia Sitchin sold millions of copies in multiple languages and inspired numerous derivative works by other authors who elaborated upon or modified his basic premises, creating a genre of ancient astronaut literature within which the Anunnaki occupied a central position. Television programs, documentary films, and internet communities devoted to ancient astronaut theories have continued to disseminate versions of the Anunnaki narrative to audiences who may have little exposure to the academic scholarship on Mesopotamian religion, creating a situation in which popular understanding of the Anunnaki often bears little relationship to the textual and archaeological evidence that scholars have assembled over the past century and a half of research. The persistence of the ancient astronaut interpretation, despite its scholarly rejection, reflects broader patterns in contemporary culture regarding attitudes toward academic expertise, the appeal of alternative historical narratives, and the human desire to find cosmic significance in the ancient past. The Anunnaki have also entered contemporary popular culture through channels distinct from the ancient astronaut genre, appearing in fiction, video games, film, and other media that draw upon Mesopotamian mythology for creative inspiration, without necessarily endorsing the extraterrestrial interpretation. The richness of the Mesopotamian mythological tradition, with its dramatic narratives of divine conflict, its powerful female deities, its sophisticated cosmological frameworks, and its exploration of fundamental human concerns including mortality, the relationship between gods and humans, and the origins of civilization, provides abundant material for creative adaptation in contemporary contexts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, recognized as one of the oldest works of literature in human history, and as a profound meditation on friendship, mortality, and the human condition, has been adapted, retold, and referenced in numerous contemporary works, bringing elements of the tradition associated with the Anunnaki to audiences who encounter these materials through artistic rather than scholarly or pseudo-scholarly channels. The academic study of the Anunnaki and Mesopotamian religion continues in universities, museums, and research institutions around the world, with ongoing excavations in Iraq and Syria providing new textual and material evidence that refines and extends scholarly understanding of the ancient traditions. The political circumstances of the Middle East in recent decades, including the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Gulf War of 1991, the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the rise of the Islamic State in the 2010s, have complicated archaeological work in the region and have resulted in damage to ancient sites and the looting of museums containing artifacts central. The transformation of Mesopotamian religious life under Achaemenid rule proceeded gradually rather than through any dramatic act of suppression or prohibition, reflecting the pragmatic approach that characterized Persian imperial governance throughout its vast and culturally diverse territories. The temples of Marduk, Nabu, Shamash, and the other great deities of the traditional pantheon continued to receive offerings. Their priesthoods continued to perform the ancient rituals, and the cuneiform scribble traditions continued to produce copies of sacred texts in the traditional Sumerian and Akkadian languages. The economic functions of the temples, which had served for millennia as centres of agricultural production, commercial exchange, and redistributive economics, remained largely intact under Persian administration, and the temple archives from cities such as Sippar, Uruk, and Borsippa document the continuation of everyday religious and economic activities well into the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. The Anunnaki, as a collective designation for the great gods who governed the cosmic and terrestrial orders, still appeared in the theological vocabulary of the Babylonian priesthood during this period, though the political circumstances that had once given their worship its grandest expressions of royal patronage had been permanently altered by the incorporation of Mesopotamia into an empire whose ruling dynasty worshipped Ahura Mazda rather than Marduk or Enlil. The gradual erosion of the traditional religious systems during the Achaemenid period involved multiple factors that operated simultaneously across different levels of Mesopotamian society. The displacement of the Babylonian royal court as the primary patron of temple construction, ritual performance, and priestly maintenance removed the single most important institutional support for the elaborate ceremonial life that had characterized Mesopotamian religion at its most magnificent. The Persian kings, while generally tolerant of local religious practices throughout their empire, did not invest the same personal theological commitment in the Babylonian cults that native Mesopotamian monarchs had demonstrated for millennia. The New Year festival continued to be celebrated, and the cult statues continued to receive their daily meals, but the intimate connection between royal authority and divine sanction that had defined Mesopotamian kingship from its earliest origins no longer operated in the same manner when the king was a Persian who ruled from Persepolis or Susa rather than from Babylon itself. The Persian satraps who governed Mesopotamia on behalf of the great king maintained functional relationships with the temple establishments, recognizing their importance for social stability and economic productivity, but the relationship lacked the theological depth and mutual dependency that had characterized the bond between Mesopotamian kings and their patron deities throughout the preceding 3,000 years. The linguistic landscape of Mesopotamia also underwent significant transformation during the centuries of Persian rule, as Aramaic increasingly replaced Akkadian as the everyday spoken and administrative language of the region. The cuneiform writing system, which had served as the medium for recording Mesopotamian religious thought, literary creativity, and administrative activity since the late 4th millennium, gradually retreated from general use into the specialized preserve of the temple priesthoods, who continued to employ it for religious and scholarly purposes, even as the surrounding population adopted Aramaic script and language for their daily communications. This linguistic shift carried profound implications for the transmission and vitality of the religious traditions associated with the Anunnaki, since the mythological, ritual, and theological texts that articulated the nature and functions of the great gods existed primarily in Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform compositions, whose comprehension required specialized training that became increasingly rare outside the temple schools. The priesthoods of certain cities, particularly Uruk and Babylon, maintained remarkably tenacious traditions of cuneiform learning that would persist well into the Hellenistic period and even into the 1st century of the Common Era, preserving astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and religious compositions that represented the final expressions of intellectual traditions stretching back to the 3rd millennium. The astronomical diaries maintained by the priests of Babylon, which recorded celestial observations with remarkable precision over a period spanning several centuries, demonstrated the continued vitality of the scholarly traditions associated with the great temples, even as the broader cultural context within which those traditions had originally flourished underwent fundamental transformation. The conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander of Macedon in the years between 334 and 323 introduced yet another layer of cultural complexity to the religious landscape of Mesopotamia, as the Greek-speaking Macedonian conquerors and their successors brought with them religious traditions, philosophical frameworks, and cultural assumptions that differed substantially from both the Persian and the traditional Mesopotamian systems. Alexander himself demonstrated a characteristically pragmatic approach to Babylonian religion during his residence in the city. reportedly ordering the restoration of the great ziggurat at Enki, which had fallen into disrepair during the later Achaemenid period, and engaging with the Babylonian priesthood in ways that suggested respect for the ancient traditions and recognition of their political utility. The death of Alexander in Babylon in June of 323, and the subsequent division of his empire among his generals, resulted in the establishment of the Seleucid dynasty as the rulers of Mesopotamia, inaugurating a period of Hellenistic governance that would last for nearly 2 centuries and would introduce profound changes to the cultural and religious character of the region. The Seleucid period, which extended from the late 4th century through the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, witnessed the most complex and fascinating phase in the long twilight of traditional Mesopotamian religion and the worship of the Anunnaki. The Seleucid kings, while promoting Greek language, culture, and civic institutions throughout their territories, generally maintained the tolerant approach to local religious traditions that had characterized Hellenistic governance across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The temples of the traditional Mesopotamian gods continued to function, and in certain cities the Seleucid period actually witnessed significant building programs that renovated and expanded existing temple complexes. The Anuantum Temple and the Resh Temple at Uruk, constructed or substantially renovated during the Seleucid period, represented impressive architectural achievements that demonstrated the continued capacity of the traditional priesthoods to mobilize resources and maintain their religious institutions even under foreign political rule. The cuneiform astronomical texts from Seleucid period Babylon achieved extraordinary levels of mathematical sophistication, developing predictive methods for calculating the positions of the moon and planets that represented the pinnacle of Mesopotamian scientific achievement, and that would influence the subsequent development of Greek astronomical theory through figures such as Hipparchus. The process of religious syncretism that characterized the Hellenistic period throughout the eastern Mediterranean world also affected the traditional Mesopotamian deities, as the Greek-speaking populations of the Seleucid cities increasingly identified Mesopotamian gods with their Greek counterparts according to perceived similarities in function, character, or mythological role. The equation of Marduk with Zeus, of Nabu with Apollo, of Ishtar with Aphrodite, and of Nergal with Ares reflected the Hellenistic tendency to understand the religious diversity of the known world through the interpretive framework of Greek theology, finding universal divine principles beneath the varying names and images employed by different peoples. This process of interpretatio Graeca, as scholars have termed it, simultaneously preserved and transformed the identities of the traditional Mesopotamian deities, maintaining their cultic functions and institutional frameworks, while gradually embedding them within a cosmopolitan religious vocabulary that dissolved the distinctive theological characteristics of the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. The Anunnaki, as a collective designation for the assembly of the great gods, lost much of its specific theological meaning within this syncretic environment, as the concept of a divine assembly governing the cosmos through collective deliberation gave way to more hierarchical and philosophically inflected understandings of divine governance that reflected the influence of Greek philosophical theology on Near Eastern religious thought. The final centuries of cuneiform culture produced some of the most remarkable documents in the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization, as the last generations of traditionally trained scribes and priests compiled, organized, and preserved the accumulated knowledge and religious traditions of more than 3,000 years. The astronomical almanacs, ritual commentaries, and mythological compendiums produced during the Seleucid and early Parthian periods reflected a conscious effort to systematize and preserve intellectual and religious traditions that the priests themselves may have recognized as approaching their end. The latest datable cuneiform text currently known to scholarship, an astronomical almanac from Babylon dating to approximately 75 of the Common Era, stands as a poignant testament to the extraordinary longevity of the cuneiform tradition and to the determination of the final practitioners to maintain their ancestral learning, even as the world around them had been transformed beyond recognition by centuries of foreign rule and cultural change. The Anunnaki, whose names appeared in the earliest known Sumerian text from the late 4th millennium, thus maintained a textual presence spanning approximately 3,000 years of continuous literary and religious tradition, a duration of cultural continuity that remains virtually unparalleled in human history. The disappearance of the traditional Mesopotamian religious systems during the early centuries of the Common Era resulted from the cumulative effects of political, linguistic, cultural, and demographic transformations that had been operating for centuries rather than from any single catastrophic event or deliberate act of suppression. The Parthian Empire, which replaced the Seleucids as the dominant power in Mesopotamia during the 2nd century before the Common Era, maintained the general policy of religious tolerance that had characterized previous foreign rulers of the region, but the continued spread of Aramaic as the dominant language, the growing influence of new religious movements including early Christianity and various forms of Gnostic thought, and the progressive decline of the institutional infrastructure that had supported the traditional temple cults all contributed to the gradual extinction of the worship of the Anunnaki and their associated deities. The cities that had served as the great centres of Mesopotamian religious life for millennia experienced varying fates during this period, with some declining into insignificance, while others were transformed by new populations and new cultural orientations that had little connection to the ancient traditions. Uruk, which had maintained active cuneiform traditions into the Seleucid period, was largely abandoned by the 3rd century of the Common Era, its great temples standing empty amid the accumulating sand and rubble of a dying urban landscape. The transition from living religion to buried archaeology occurred over several centuries, during which the physical remains of Mesopotamian civilization were gradually concealed beneath layers of accumulated debris, wind-blown sand, and the construction activities of successive populations who had little knowledge of or interest in the structures beneath their feet. The great ziggurats, once the most prominent architectural features of the Mesopotamian landscape, and the physical embodiments of the connection between the divine realm of the Anunnaki and the human world they governed, slowly deteriorated through the combined effects of weathering, erosion, and the removal of baked bricks by local populations who found practical uses for the building materials of the ancient temples. The cuneiform tablets, baked or sun-dried clay documents that had recorded every aspect of Mesopotamian civilization, from royal inscriptions to household accounts to the great mythological compositions, were preserved by the very qualities of their material composition, as clay proved remarkably durable when buried in the dry soils of southern Iraq, maintaining legible inscriptions for millennia under conditions that would have destroyed papyrus, parchment, or any other organic writing medium. The unintentional preservation of these tablets created the conditions for the remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 19th century that would bring the Anunnaki and their worshippers back into human consciousness after nearly 2,000 years of oblivion. The rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamian civilization constituted one of the most dramatic intellectual achievements of the 19th century, fundamentally transforming the understanding of human history and pushing the documented record of literate civilization back by more than a millennium beyond the previously known horizons of ancient Egypt and biblical Israel. The process began not with systematic archaeological investigation, but with the curiosity of European travellers who encountered the massive artificial mounds, known locally as tells, that dotted the landscape of Ottoman-controlled Iraq, and that local traditions sometimes associated with biblical cities and figures. The identification of specific tells with ancient cities mentioned in classical Greek sources and in the Hebrew Bible provided the initial impetus for excavation, as European scholars and adventurers sought physical confirmation of the historical traditions preserved in the literary heritage of Western civilization. The connection between these archaeological investigations and the recovery of knowledge about the Anunnaki and the broader Mesopotamian religious tradition would prove to be one of the most consequential aspects of the entire enterprise, revealing a sophisticated polytheistic theological system that had been completely unknown to the modern world. The first major excavations of Mesopotamian sites commenced in the 1840s, when the French consul Paul-Émile Botta began digging at Khorsabad in northern Iraq and uncovered the palace of the Assyrian king Sargon II, constructed in the late 8th century before the Common Era and adorned with massive stone reliefs depicting royal hunts, military campaigns, and religious ceremonies. The dramatic sculptures that Botta recovered and shipped to Paris, where they were installed in the Louvre, created a public sensation in Europe and stimulated intense interest in further exploration of the Mesopotamian mounds. The British diplomat and adventurer Austin Henry Layard followed shortly afterward with excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh, ancient Assyrian capitals whose buried palaces yielded even more spectacular finds, including the famous winged bull colossi that now stand in the British Museum and that represented the protective supernatural beings associated with the divine guardianship of the Assyrian kings. The excavations at Nineveh proved particularly consequential for the recovery of Mesopotamian religious literature, as Layard and his successors uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, which contained tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets covering subjects ranging from royal correspondence to medical prescriptions to the great mythological compositions that had been collected and preserved under royal patronage. The tablets from Ashurbanipal's library and from subsequent excavations at sites throughout Iraq presented 19th century scholars with an enormous intellectual challenge, as the cuneiform script in which they were written had been extinct for nearly 2 millennia, and the languages it recorded, Sumerian and Akkadian, were entirely unknown to modern scholarship. The decipherment of cuneiform, which proceeded through a series of brilliant scholarly achievements, beginning with the work of Georg Friedrich Grotefend on Old Persian inscriptions in the early 19th century, and culminating in the collaborative efforts of Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert in the 1850s, ranks among the greatest intellectual accomplishments of modern philology, and provided the key that would unlock the vast literary and religious heritage of ancient Mesopotamia. The ability to read cuneiform texts transformed the strange and fragmentary archaeological remains recovered from the Mesopotamian mounds into a comprehensive civilization with its own history, literature, science, and religion. A civilization whose existence had been almost entirely unsuspected before the excavations began, and whose cultural achievements rivaled or exceeded those of contemporary ancient Egypt and classical Greece. The translation of the great mythological texts during the second half of the 19th century brought the Anunnaki and their associated mythology to the attention of the educated European public for the first time since the end of antiquity, creating intellectual sensations that resonated far beyond the specialized world of Assyriology, and that raised profound questions about the origins and development of religious traditions that modern Western civilization had inherited through the biblical tradition. The single most dramatic moment in this process of recovery occurred in 1872, when the British Museum assistant George Smith, working through the tablet collections from Nineveh, identified and translated a passage from the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh that described a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, from which a single righteous man escaped by building a large boat and loading it with animals and family members. The parallels between this Mesopotamian flood narrative, composed at least a millennium before the earliest possible date for the composition of the biblical book of Genesis, and the familiar story of Noah and the Ark proved electrifying to the Victorian public, which was already engaged in intense debates about the historical accuracy of the Bible and the implications of Darwinian evolutionary theory for traditional religious belief. Smith presented his translation at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December of 1872, and the resulting publicity generated such intense public interest that the Daily Telegraph newspaper funded an expedition to Nineveh to search for the missing portions of the tablet, an expedition that achieved the remarkable success of recovering additional fragments that completed significant portions of the narrative. The implications of the Mesopotamian flood story and of the broader mythological corpus for the understanding of biblical origins became one of the central intellectual preoccupations of late 19th and early 20th century scholarship, generating debates that continue in modified form to the present day. The recognition that many of the narratives preserved in the early chapters of Genesis, including the creation of humanity from clay, the garden paradise, the great flood, and the tower whose builders sought to reach heaven, had clear parallels in the much older Sumerian and Akkadian literary traditions, raised fundamental questions about the relationship between biblical and Mesopotamian literature that scholars addressed through a variety of theoretical frameworks. The Pan-Babylonian school, which flourished in German scholarship around the turn of the 20th century, argued that Babylonian mythology and astral religion had exercised a pervasive influence on virtually all ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean religious traditions, including the religion of ancient Israel, a position that generated both productive scholarly investigation and considerable theological controversy. The more moderate consensus that emerged over subsequent decades acknowledged the clear literary and conceptual connections between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, while recognizing the distinctive theological transformations that Israelite authors had imposed on the borrowed materials, particularly the replacement of the polytheistic divine assembly of the Anunnaki with the singular divine sovereignty of the biblical God. The scholarly recovery of the Anunnaki and the broader Mesopotamian religious tradition continued throughout the 20th century as new excavations, new tablet discoveries, and increasingly sophisticated philological methods progressively deepened the understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian religious thought. The excavation of the Sumerian city of Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania, which continued intermittently from the 1880s through the 20th century, recovered thousands of Sumerian literary tablets that substantially expanded the known corpus of mythological, hymnic, and ritual compositions, and that revealed the earliest forms of the theological traditions that later Babylonian and Assyrian religion would inherit and transform. The work of Samuel Noah Kramer, whose publications from the 1940s through the 1980s made Sumerian literature accessible to a broad English-speaking audience for the first time, played a particularly significant role in establishing the Sumerians and their gods in the popular historical imagination, with books bearing titles that emphasized the priority and originality of Sumerian cultural achievements in areas ranging from law to education to philosophical reflection. The Anunnaki, once forgotten for nearly 2 millennia, had been restored to their position in the historical record as the divine beings at the heart of humanity's earliest known civilization, and their myths had been recognized as the ancestors of narrative traditions that continued to shape Western religious and literary consciousness. The scholarly recovery of the Anunnaki and their associated mythological traditions represented one of the great intellectual achievements of 19th and 20th century historical research, a painstaking reconstruction of an entire religious worldview from fragmentary clay tablets and the patient labour of generations of philologists who had taught themselves to read languages that no human voice had spoken for more than 2,000 years. The gods who had presided over the temple complexes of ancient Sumer and Akkad, who had received the prayers and offerings of countless generations of Mesopotamian worshippers, who had been invoked in royal inscriptions and praised in elaborate hymnic compositions, had returned to human consciousness through the scholarly apparatus of modern archaeology and comparative linguistics. The implications of this recovery extended far beyond the boundaries of academic Assyriology, touching upon fundamental questions of biblical interpretation, the origins of religious thought, and the deep continuities that link the earliest civilizations to the religious traditions that continue to shape human culture in the modern world. The Anunnaki had been restored to their position in the historical record through the meticulous processes of academic investigation, their myths analysed according to the methodological standards of comparative religion and literary criticism, their theological significance assessed within the frameworks of scholarly discourse that emphasised historical context, literary form, and the developmental processes through which religious ideas evolved across the millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. The scholarly understanding of the Anunnaki that emerged from this century of intensive research emphasized the antiquity and complexity of Mesopotamian religious thought, while situating that thought firmly within the conditions of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The gods of Mesopotamia were understood as the products of particular historical, social, and environmental circumstances, their characteristics shaped by the agricultural and urban conditions of the river valley civilizations, their mythologies reflecting the concerns of societies dependent upon irrigation, vulnerable to flooding, organized around temple economies, and governed by political structures that claim divine sanction for royal authority. The scholarly consensus that emerged treated the Anunnaki as fascinating objects of historical investigation, valuable for what they revealed about the development of human religious consciousness and the literary antecedents of later religious traditions, but emphatically as products of the ancient past, rather than as beings possessing any contemporary relevance beyond their historical and literary significance. The gods of Mesopotamia had been recovered, studied, and contextualized according to the methodological standards of modern historical scholarship, and their recovery had enriched the understanding of ancient civilization, while simultaneously confirming their status as the projections of cultures that had long since passed from the stage of human history. The popular reception of the recovered Anunnaki mythology, however, would prove considerably more complex than the scholarly consensus might have suggested, and the late 20th century witnessed the emergence of alternative interpretations that departed radically from the methodological frameworks of academic Assyriology. The figure whose work would prove most influential in reshaping popular understanding of the Anunnaki was Zecharia Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born writer who had emigrated to Palestine as a child and later settled in the United States, where he worked as a journalist and shipping executive while pursuing his interest in ancient languages and Near Eastern archaeology. Sitchin's background included study of modern Hebrew and claimed familiarity with ancient Semitic languages, though his interpretations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts would be consistently rejected by scholars trained in the philological methods of academic Assyriology. The first volume of Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series, published in 1976 under the title The 12th Planet, introduced the interpretive framework that would prove enormously influential in alternative history circles while generating sustained criticism from mainstream scholars who challenge both his linguistic methodology and his scientific claims. The central thesis of Sitchin's work proposed that the Anunnaki described in Sumerian and Akkadian mythological texts were not the imaginary projections of ancient religious consciousness, but rather actual extraterrestrial beings who had travelled to Earth from a planet that Sitchin identified as Nibiru, a hypothetical body that he claimed occupied an elongated orbit around the Sun with a period of approximately 3,600 years. According to Sitchin's interpretation, the Anunnaki had arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago in search of gold, which they required for purposes related to the atmosphere of their home planet, and had established operations in the region that would later be known as Mesopotamia. Finding the labour of gold extraction burdensome, the Anunnaki had genetically engineered human beings from existing hominid populations to serve as workers, thereby creating the species known as Homo sapiens through deliberate technological intervention rather than through the natural processes of biological evolution. The myths preserved in the Sumerian and Akkadian literary traditions, according to Sitchin's reading, were not symbolic or imaginative compositions but rather garbled accounts of these actual historical events, passed down through oral tradition and eventually recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets that modern scholars had misinterpreted by reading literally what should be understood technologically and reading metaphorically what should be understood literally. Sitchin's interpretation drew upon the mythological materials recovered by 19th and 20th century Assyriology, while imposing upon them a hermeneutic framework entirely foreign to the methods of academic scholarship. The creation of humanity from clay in the myth of Enki and Ninmah became, in Sitchin's reading, a description of genetic engineering conducted in laboratories. The divine assembly of the Anunnaki became a governing council of extraterrestrial administrators. The ziggurats and temple complexes of ancient Mesopotamia became landing platforms and communication installations. The elaborate terminology of Sumerian religious literature, which scholars had carefully analysed within the context of ancient Near Eastern religious thought, was reinterpreted by Sitchin as technical vocabulary describing spacecraft, genetic procedures, and extraterrestrial technologies. The flood narrative preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and related texts became an account of a natural catastrophe that the Anunnaki had predicted through their advanced scientific knowledge and had chosen to allow to destroy the human population they had created, with Utnapishtim's survival representing an act of insubordination by the god Enki against the decision of the divine assembly. The scholarly response to Sitchin's work was consistently negative, with specialists in Sumerian and Akkadian language and literature rejecting his translations as fundamentally inaccurate and his interpretive framework as methodologically unsound. Academic Assyriologists pointed to numerous instances where Sitchin's translations departed from the established meanings of Sumerian and Akkadian terms, where his interpretations ignored the literary and religious contexts within which the ancient texts had been composed and transmitted, and where his claims about Mesopotamian astronomy and cosmology conflicted with the evidence preserved in the actual cuneiform sources. The astronomical hypothesis of a planet Nibiru occupying the orbit Sitchin described was rejected by planetary scientists as incompatible with the dynamics of the solar system and unsupported by observational evidence. The genetic engineering scenario was criticised as anachronistic, imposing modern technological concepts upon texts composed millennia before the development of the relevant scientific knowledge. The overall interpretive framework was characterised as a form of euhemerism, the ancient practice of interpreting mythological narratives as distorted accounts of historical events, applied with particular lack of philological rigour and combined with speculative claims about extraterrestrial intervention that had no basis in the textual or archaeological evidence. Despite the consistent rejection of Sitchin's work by academic specialists, his books achieved substantial commercial success, and exercised considerable influence on popular understanding of ancient Mesopotamian religion. The Earth Chronicles series eventually expanded to 7 volumes, published between 1976 and 2007, each elaborating upon the central thesis while extending the interpretive framework to encompass additional mythological traditions from Egypt, the Americas, and other ancient civilizations. The appeal of Sitchin's interpretation derived in part from its narrative power, offering a dramatic account of human origins that combined elements of science fiction with the exotic allure of ancient mythology, while promising to reveal hidden truths concealed within familiar religious traditions. The interpretation also resonated with broader cultural currents of the late 20th century, including skepticism toward established academic authority, interest in alternative forms of knowledge, fascination with extraterrestrial life, and the perennial human desire to discover special significance in the distant past. The Anunnaki, as reinterpreted by Sitchin, offered not merely historical curiosity but contemporary relevance, suggesting that humanity's origins and destiny were bound up with cosmic forces whose return remained a possibility within the prophetic framework of the Earth Chronicles narrative. The influence of Sitchin's interpretation extended beyond his own writings to shape a broader genre of ancient astronaut speculation that proliferated through books, television programs, and internet communities during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The History Channel television series Ancient Aliens, which premiered in 2010 and continued for multiple seasons, frequently featured discussions of the Anunnaki within the interpretive framework that Sitchin had established, presenting his theories to audiences of millions while treating them as legitimate alternatives to mainstream scholarly understanding. The internet enabled the rapid dissemination of ancient astronaut theories and the formation of communities dedicated to elaborating upon and extending Sitchin's original interpretations, with websites, forums, and video platforms hosting extensive discussions of the Anunnaki that drew upon and modified the Earth Chronicles framework. The terminology of Sitchin's interpretation, including the planet Nibiru and the concept of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial genetic engineers, became widely familiar within popular culture, frequently referenced in contexts ranging from conspiracy theories to science fiction to new religious movements. The gap between scholarly and popular understanding of the Anunnaki that developed during the late 20th century represented a striking case study in the divergent trajectories that ancient materials could follow when released from the specialized context of academic investigation into the broader currents of popular culture. The same cuneiform tablets that scholars read as evidence for the development of ancient religious thought and literary tradition were read by followers of Sitchin and related interpreters as evidence for extraterrestrial intervention in human history. The same mythological narratives that Assyriologists analyzed according to the methods of comparative religion and form criticism were treated by ancient astronaut theorists as garbled historical accounts requiring technological decipherment. The Anunnaki had been restored to human consciousness through the scholarly apparatus of modern archaeology and philology, but the meanings attributed to them by popular audiences frequently departed radically from the understandings that academic specialists derived from the same textual and material evidence. The ancient gods of Mesopotamia had become, in the popular imagination, something quite different from what they had represented either to their original worshippers or to the scholars who had recovered their names and narratives from the buried libraries of Nineveh and Nippur. The response of academic Assyriology to the proliferation of ancient astronaut theories concerning the Anunnaki involved both direct criticism of specific claims and broader efforts at public education regarding Mesopotamian religion and culture. Scholars such as Michael Heiser, who possessed training in ancient Near Eastern languages and had studied the relevant texts in their original forms, published detailed critiques of Sitchin's translations and interpretations, demonstrating the numerous points at which his readings departed from established scholarly understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian language and literature. Professional associations and academic institutions developed resources aimed at providing accurate information about ancient Mesopotamian civilization to general audiences, seeking to correct misconceptions promoted by ancient astronaut theories while making the genuine achievements of Assyriology accessible beyond the specialized context of academic publication. Museums displaying Mesopotamian artifacts increasingly addressed the gap between scholarly and popular understanding in their educational programming, acknowledging the existence of alternative theories while explaining the methodological foundations of academic interpretation. The effort to maintain scholarly standards while engaging with popular misconceptions represented an ongoing challenge for specialists whose primary training and institutional context oriented them toward addressing audiences of fellow researchers rather than toward the broader public discourse within which the Anunnaki had acquired their modern notoriety. The ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki, despite its rejection by academic specialists, illustrated broader patterns in the cultural reception of ancient materials that extended beyond the specific case of Mesopotamian mythology. The desire to find special significance in the distant past, to discover hidden truths concealed within familiar traditions, to connect human origins with cosmic forces operating beyond the ordinary scale of historical causation, reflected persistent tendencies in human meaning-making that academic scholarship could critique, but could not simply eliminate through the presentation of contrary evidence. The appeal of ancient astronaut theories derived not primarily from their persuasiveness, when assessed according to scholarly methodological standards, but rather from their satisfaction of emotional and imaginative needs that operated according to different criteria. The Anunnaki, as reinterpreted by Sitchin and his followers, offered a mythology for the modern age, combining the exotic allure of the ancient past with the technological vocabulary of science fiction and the revelatory structure of conspiracy narrative. The fact that this modern mythology departed radically from the meanings that the ancient Mesopotamians had attributed to their gods, and equally radically from the scholarly understandings that academic Assyriology had developed through a century of careful textual analysis, did not diminish its cultural influence or its appeal to audiences seeking alternative frameworks for understanding human origins and destiny. The contemporary status of the Anunnaki thus reflected the convergence of multiple historical trajectories that had brought these ancient divine beings to their current position in human cultural consciousness. The original Mesopotamian worship of the Anunnaki had faded with the decline of cuneiform civilization under the successive conquests of Persians, Greeks, Parthians, and Sasanians, leaving behind only the buried tablets and ruined temple complexes that would await discovery by future generations. The scholarly recovery of the Anunnaki through 19th and 20th century archaeology and philology had restored these gods to the historical record, revealing them as the divine powers at the heart of humanity's earliest known civilization, and establishing their myths as the ancestors of narrative traditions that continue to influence Western religious consciousness. The popular reinterpretation of the Anunnaki through the lens of ancient astronaut theory had transformed them into something quite different from either their original character or their scholarly reconstruction, making them figures of contemporary speculation and controversy, whose significance extended beyond the boundaries of historical investigation into the realms of alternative belief and popular imagination. The Anunnaki had become, in the early 21st century, simultaneously objects of scholarly research, subjects of popular fascination, and symbols of the divergent frameworks through which modern culture approached the materials of the ancient past. The physical remains of the Mesopotamian religious tradition continue to offer testimony to the power and persistence of the Anunnaki worship that had flourished for more than 3 millennia in the lands between the rivers. The ziggurat of Ur, partially restored during the 20th century, stood as the most visible surviving monument of the architectural tradition that had sought to bring the divine and human realms into proximity through the construction of artificial mountains rising from the flat alluvial plain. The remains of similar structures at Nippur, Eridu, Borsippa, and numerous other ancient sites, though considerably more ruined than the Ur ziggurat, testify to the systematic investment of labour and resources that successive generations of Mesopotamian rulers had directed toward the maintenance of proper relations with the divine assembly. The hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets preserved in museums around the world, the vast majority still untranslated and unpublished, continued to offer the prospect of new discoveries and refined understandings of the religious traditions within which the Anunnaki had occupied their central position. The scholarly enterprise that had recovered these materials from oblivion continued into the 21st century, with new generations of Assyriologists building upon the philological foundations established by their predecessors, while employing new technologies and methodological approaches to extract additional information from the ancient sources. The lands where the Anunnaki had once been worshipped, the fertile plain that the Greeks had named Mesopotamia, and that modern maps labelled as Iraq, had experienced dramatic transformations during the decades following the initial scholarly recovery of the cuneiform heritage. The excavations that had revealed the tablets of Nineveh and the temples of Nippur had taken place under the political conditions of Ottoman rule and British mandate, and the subsequent decades of Iraqi independence had witnessed periods of both productive archaeological cooperation and violent disruption. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Gulf War of 1991, and the invasion and occupation that began in 2003 had subjected the archaeological sites of ancient Mesopotamia to various forms of damage and disruption, from direct military activity to the looting that flourished during periods of political instability. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which housed some of the most significant artifacts of Mesopotamian civilization, suffered substantial losses during the chaos that followed the 2003 invasion, though subsequent recovery efforts retrieved many of the stolen items. The ancient sites themselves, scattered across a landscape that remained dangerous and politically unstable, continued to face threats from unauthorized excavation, agricultural encroachment, and the general absence of the protective infrastructure that archaeological preservation required. The physical heritage of the Anunnaki, the material evidence of the religious tradition that had flourished for 3 millennia in the cities of the Tigris-Euphrates plain, remained vulnerable to the political and economic forces that continued to shape the modern Middle East. The ziggurats that had once dominated the urban landscapes of Sumer and Akkad stood in various states of preservation across the Iraqi countryside, their mud brick cores exposed to the elements that the ancient builders had sought to protect against through regular maintenance and periodic reconstruction. The ziggurat of Ur, whose restoration by Iraqi authorities in the 1980s had returned it to something approximating its ancient profile, remained the most intact example of the architectural form, its triple staircases ascending to the upper platform where the temple of the moon god Nana had once stood. The ziggurat of Akarkuf, located near modern Baghdad and dating from the Kassite period of Babylonian history, preserved its massive core to a height of more than 50 metres, though its facing and upper structures had long since disappeared. The remains at Nippur, Eridu, Borsippa and other ancient religious centres offered progressively less complete testimony to the architectural ambitions of their builders, their outlines barely discernible amid the accumulated debris of millennia of abandonment and erosion. These monuments, once the centres of elaborate ritual complexes served by thousands of priests and temple functionaries, had become silent witnesses to religious traditions whose detailed observances could only be partially reconstructed from the textual and material evidence that archaeology had recovered. The transformation of these silent witnesses into objects of popular imagination, however, represented a development that the philologists and archaeologists who had laboured to recover the Mesopotamian heritage could scarcely have anticipated. The scholarly enterprise that had translated the cuneiform tablets and excavated the ancient cities had always operated within the relatively circumscribed world of academic Assyriology, a discipline that required years of specialised training in dead languages and that published its findings in technical journals accessible primarily to other specialists. The movement of Mesopotamian religious content from this scholarly context into the broader currents of popular culture had begun almost immediately upon the initial translations of the great mythological texts, as writers, artists, and religious thinkers recognised the profound implications of these newly recovered narratives for understanding the origins of Western religious traditions. The biblical resonances that 19th century scholars had identified in the Mesopotamian flood narrative, the creation accounts, and the descent myths had generated substantial public interest in the ancient sources, particularly among audiences concerned with questions of biblical historicity and the relationship between scriptural accounts and their apparent Near Eastern precursors. This initial wave of popular engagement with Mesopotamian mythology, however, had generally respected the scholarly frameworks within which the materials had been recovered and interpreted, treating the ancient texts as valuable evidence for understanding the cultural context of biblical literature, rather than as sources for alternative religious or historical claims that contradicted mainstream scholarly understanding. The emergence of interpretive frameworks that departed radically from academic consensus regarding the Mesopotamian religious heritage represented a phenomenon of the later 20th century, arising from the convergence of several cultural currents that had little connection to the philological traditions of professional Assyriology. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 1970s had generated widespread interest in alternative spiritual traditions, non-Western religious systems, and critiques of established institutional authority, creating audiences receptive to claims that challenged orthodox understandings of human history and religious origins. The space age had captured public imagination with the reality of human travel beyond Earth's atmosphere, prompting speculation about the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence and the potential for contact between human civilization and beings from other worlds. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, which proposed that extraterrestrial visitors had influenced human civilization in prehistoric times, emerged from this cultural context as a framework that could accommodate both the appetite for alternative spirituality and the fascination with space exploration that characterized the era. The application of this hypothesis to Mesopotamian mythology would transform the Anunnaki from objects of scholarly investigation into figures of popular speculation, generating a body of alternative interpretation that would eventually reach audiences far larger than the academic literature had ever achieved. The figure most responsible for this transformation was Zecharia Sitchin, a Russian-born author who emigrated first to Palestine and subsequently to the United States, where he would develop the interpretive framework that became known as the ancient astronaut theory of Mesopotamian religion. Sitchin's background included study of ancient Hebrew and familiarity with biblical and Near Eastern texts, though his formal training did not include the specialized philological education that professional Assyriologists underwent in their preparation for reading cuneiform sources. His first book, published in 1976 under the title The 12th Planet, presented an elaborate reinterpretation of Mesopotamian mythology that identified the Anunnaki not as divine beings in the conventional religious sense, but as extraterrestrial visitors from a hypothetical planet that Sitchin designated Nibiru, which he claimed occupied an elongated orbit around the Sun with a period of approximately 3600 years. According to Sitchin's interpretation, the Anunnaki had travelled to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago in search of gold and other resources, had genetically engineered human beings from existing hominid populations to serve as a labour force for mining operations, and had established the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia as colonial outposts before eventually departing the planet, while leaving behind the mythological and textual records that Sumerian priests had preserved without understanding their true technological significance. The specific claims that Sitchin advanced regarding the cuneiform sources required interpretive choices that professional Assyriologists rejected as philologically unfounded. His identification of the term Anunnaki as referring to extraterrestrial beings from Nibiru depended upon etymological analyses that contradicted the scholarly consensus regarding the meaning and derivation of the Sumerian term. His readings of specific texts, including the Enuma Elish and various Sumerian creation narratives, required translations that differed substantially from those produced by scholars trained in the cuneiform languages, often attributing technological meanings to terms that conventional Assyriology understood as referring to natural phenomena, divine attributes, or mythological concepts. His claim that Mesopotamian astronomical texts recorded knowledge of a 12th planet invisible to modern observation rested upon interpretations of celestial catalogues and astronomical omens that specialists in Babylonian astronomy found unsupportable. The academic community's response to Sitchin's work, when it took notice of his publications at all, ranged from dismissive criticism to detailed refutation of his specific philological claims, with Assyriologists such as Michael Heiser producing point-by-point analyses demonstrating the divergences between Sitchin's translations and the readings that cuneiform specialists accepted as accurate. The scholarly rejection of Sitchin's interpretive framework, however, had remarkably little impact upon the popular reception of his ideas, which continued to attract substantial audiences throughout the remaining decades of his life and beyond his death in 2010. The 12 books that Sitchin published between 1976 and 2010, collectively known as the Earth Chronicles series, sold millions of copies worldwide and were translated into numerous languages, establishing the ancient astronaut interpretation of Mesopotamian religion as a fixture of the alternative history genre that flourished during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The appeal of Sitchin's framework derived not from its conformity with academic standards of philological accuracy, but from its capacity to satisfy psychological and spiritual needs that conventional scholarship did not address, offering readers a vision of human origins that combined the authority of ancient texts with the technological wonder of space travel, while positioning conventional religious and scientific institutions as guardians of suppressed truth that independent researchers could uncover. The Anunnaki, in this alternative tradition, became not merely interesting objects of scholarly investigation, but cosmic ancestors whose return might be anticipated, figures of continuing spiritual significance whose true nature established authorities had either failed to recognize or deliberately concealed. The cultural influence of the ancient astronaut interpretation extended far beyond Sitchin's own publications, generating a substantial literature of derivative works, documentary productions, and online content that developed and elaborated the basic framework in various directions. The emergence of the Internet as a platform for the distribution of alternative historical claims created new possibilities for the circulation of ancient astronaut ideas among audiences who might never have encountered Sitchin's books in conventional publishing contexts. Websites, discussion forums, and eventually social media platforms became venues for communities organized around belief in the extraterrestrial origins of the Anunnaki, spaces where adherents could share interpretive claims, debate variations in the theoretical framework, and reinforce one another's conviction that mainstream scholarship was either mistaken or complicit in concealing the truth about human origins. The documentary film genre provided another avenue for the popularization of ancient astronaut claims, with productions such as the Ancient Aliens television series, which began airing on the History Channel in 2009, presenting variations on the ancient astronaut hypothesis to audiences of millions while featuring the Anunnaki prominently in episodes devoted to Mesopotamian civilization. The transformation of professional scholars into apparent supporting witnesses for claims they did not endorse, through the selective quotation of academic sources and the presentation of fringe theorists alongside genuine experts, became a characteristic technique of such productions, blurring the distinction between scholarly research and alternative speculation in ways that many academics found troubling. The scholarly community's engagement with the ancient astronaut phenomenon raised difficult questions about the relationship between academic expertise and public understanding of the ancient past. The professional Assyriologists who possessed the linguistic and methodological training necessary to evaluate claims about cuneiform sources were relatively few in number. Their publications were largely inaccessible to general audiences, and their institutional positions rarely afforded them the time or resources to engage extensively with popular misconceptions about their field. The asymmetry between the reach of ancient astronaut claims, amplified by commercial publishing, television programming, and internet distribution, and the limited circulation of academic corrections created conditions under which alternative interpretations could establish themselves in popular consciousness without effective scholarly challenge. The Anunnaki who existed in popular imagination at the turn of the 21st century bore little resemblance to the divine assembly that philologists had reconstructed from cuneiform sources, but this imaginative construction had achieved a cultural presence that the scholarly understanding could not match. The situation paralleled developments in other fields where complex technical knowledge was required to evaluate popular claims, from climate science to evolutionary biology, revealing the challenges that democratic societies faced in maintaining productive relationships between specialized expertise and public discourse about matters of common interest. The persistence of the ancient astronaut interpretation of Mesopotamian religion reflected broader patterns in the cultural politics of knowledge that characterized the contemporary period. The democratization of information access that digital technologies had enabled existed in tension with the specialized training that interpretation of ancient sources required, creating conditions under which claims about the past could circulate widely without regard for the methodological standards that professional historians and philologists employed in their evaluation of evidence. The distrust of institutional authority that motivated much alternative history writing found justification in genuine instances of scholarly error, ideological bias, and institutional corruption, even as this distrust extended to dismissing expert consensus that rested upon solid evidential foundations. The appeal of narratives that positioned ordinary people as capable of discerning truths that elites had missed or suppressed spoke to democratic instincts that had legitimate claims upon public attention, even when the specific truths being discerned had no basis in the evidence that experts considered relevant. The Anunnaki of ancient astronaut theory functioned within this cultural ecology as symbols of suppressed knowledge and cosmic connection, figures whose significance lay not in their correspondence to the beings that ancient Mesopotamians had actually worshipped, but in their capacity to organize communities of belief around shared convictions about the nature of human origins and the limitations of official knowledge. The coexistence of scholarly and alternative understandings of the Anunnaki in contemporary culture illustrated the complex relationships between ancient materials and modern meanings that characterize the study of the ancient Near East more broadly. The cuneiform tablets that 19th century excavators had recovered from the mounds of Iraq contained information about religious beliefs and practices that had genuine historical existence, expressions of the spiritual life of peoples who had inhabited the Tigris-Euphrates plain millennia before the present. The philological work that had made these texts accessible had revealed a religious tradition of remarkable sophistication and complexity, one that had influenced the development of subsequent religious systems, and that continued to offer insights into the nature of ancient religious thought. This scholarly achievement, however, existed alongside interpretive frameworks that bore no relationship to the methodological standards of academic research, frameworks that used the vocabulary and imagery of Mesopotamian religion for purposes that the ancient worshippers of the Anunnaki could not have recognized or anticipated. The divine assembly that had governed the cosmos according to Sumerian and Akkadian understanding had become, in one contemporary context, the subject of careful philological investigation, and, in another, the focus of speculative claims about extraterrestrial intervention in human evolution. Both contexts produced texts, images, and communities organized around engagement with the Anunnaki, but the relationship between ancient materials and modern meanings differed fundamentally between the scholarly and alternative traditions. The question of how to evaluate these competing engagements with the Mesopotamian heritage raised issues that extended beyond the specific case of ancient astronaut theory to touch upon broader questions about the nature of historical knowledge and its relationship to contemporary cultural needs. The scholarly tradition that had recovered the cuneiform heritage operated according to principles of evidential accountability and methodological transparency, principles that enabled the correction of error and the refinement of understanding over time through the collective evaluation of claims against available evidence. The alternative tradition that had reinterpreted the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings operated according to different principles, prioritizing narrative coherence, emotional resonance, and the satisfaction of psychological needs over conformity with philological or archaeological evidence. Neither tradition was entirely free of the influence of contemporary concerns upon the interpretation of ancient materials, as scholars too brought presuppositions and cultural expectations to their engagement with cuneiform sources, but the mechanisms for identifying and correcting such influences differed substantially between the traditions. The academic community's commitment to peer review, methodological debate, and the subordination of individual claims to collective evaluation created conditions under which errors could be identified and corrected, even if such correction often occurred more slowly and incompletely than ideal standards would require. The alternative community's commitment to individual revelation and the rejection of institutional authority created conditions under which errors, once established, could persist indefinitely without effective challenge. The physical landscapes where the Anunnaki had been worshipped remained, throughout all these developments in interpretation and imagination, the silent ground upon which the textual and material evidence rested. The mounds of southern Iraq, their surfaces littered with pottery fragments and their interiors containing the accumulated debris of millennia of human habitation, continued to hold information that future generations of archaeologists might recover and analyze. The tablets already excavated and housed in museums from Baghdad to London to Philadelphia continued to offer possibilities for new discoveries, as advances in imaging technology, philological understanding, and comparative methodology enabled scholars to extract information that earlier generations had been unable to perceive. The languages that had preserved the names and attributes of the Anunnaki, Sumerian and Akkadian, and their various dialects and descendants, continued to yield their secrets to the patient labour of specialists who devoted careers to the mastery of scripts and grammars that had not been living means of communication for more than 2,000 years. The enterprise of recovering the Mesopotamian heritage, which had begun with the curiosity of European travellers and the ambitions of colonial administrators, continued into the 21st century as a scholarly project of remarkable scope and complexity, one that had transformed human understanding of the ancient world, while remaining incomplete in ways that promised continued discoveries for generations of future researchers. The return to these physical realities after the excursion into modern interpretive controversies revealed the fundamental asymmetry between the ancient evidence and its contemporary uses. The ziggurats that rose from the Iraqi plain, the tablets that filled museum storerooms, the cylinder seals and boundary stones and administrative records that documented the daily operations of ancient Mesopotamian society all possessed a material reality independent of the interpretive frameworks that modern observers brought to their examination. The Anunnaki who appeared in these sources had been real to their worshippers in ways that required neither validation nor rejection by contemporary belief systems, real in the sense that the religious life of ancient Mesopotamia had organized itself around their veneration and appeasement. The temples that served these deities had consumed vast quantities of economic resources. The priesthoods that performed their rituals had constituted significant fractions of urban populations. The festivals and observances that marked the sacred calendar had structured the temporal experience of societies across millennia. Whatever meanings modern audiences chose to attach to these facts, the facts themselves retained their evidentiary character, available for examination according to the methodological standards that scholarly investigation had developed for the assessment of ancient sources. The long afternoon of the Anunnaki, stretching from the twilight of ancient Mesopotamian civilization through the centuries of forgetting and the generations of recovery, had thus produced a situation in which the gods of ancient Sumer existed simultaneously in multiple registers of contemporary awareness. They existed in the scholarly literature as objects of continuing investigation, their names, attributes, and worship practices reconstructed with increasing precision through the patient accumulation of philological and archaeological evidence. They existed in popular culture as figures of romantic imagination, their exotic Sumerian names and ancient Mesopotamian settings, providing atmosphere and authenticity for various forms of entertainment and aesthetic production. They existed in alternative belief systems as cosmic ancestors or extraterrestrial visitors, their mythological attributes reinterpreted according to frameworks that academic specialists rejected, but that attracted substantial popular followings. And they existed, most fundamentally, in the material evidence that had survived from antiquity, the tablets and monuments and architectural remains that continue to offer information about the religious life of the ancient Near East, regardless of the interpretive frameworks that modern observers chose to apply to their examination. The multiplicity of these existence testified to the productivity of ancient materials as resources for contemporary meaning-making, a productivity that the academic community could neither fully control nor entirely approve, but that demonstrated the continuing vitality of engagement with the ancient past. The question of what the Anunnaki had meant to their original worshippers, those countless generations of Mesopotamians who had built the temples and performed the rituals and organized their lives around the veneration of these divine beings, remained the essential inquiry that scholarly investigation sought to address, even as popular culture and alternative belief systems generated their own answers to different questions entirely. The ancient Sumerians, who had first given names and attributes to these gods, had not been concerned with extraterrestrial origins or cosmic genetic engineering, but with the fundamental challenges of human existence in a world whose operations they attributed to divine agency, and whose continued functioning they believed required constant attention to the maintenance of proper relationships between the human and divine realms. The Anunnaki had provided a framework for understanding why the Tigris and Euphrates flooded when they did, why crops grew or failed, why cities prospered or fell to enemies, why individual lives followed the trajectories they did through fortune and misfortune, health and illness, success and failure. The gods had not been abstract principles or distant cosmic forces, but immediate presences whose favour could be sought through proper worship and whose anger could be placated through appropriate offerings and observances. The temple that stood at the centre of each Mesopotamian city had not been merely a monument to divine power, but an active institution through which the relationship between the human community and its patron deity was continuously maintained. A house where the god literally dwelt, and where the god's needs for food, clothing, entertainment and service were attended to by dedicated personnel whose lives were organised around these sacred duties. The emotional texture of ancient Mesopotamian religious experience, the feelings that worshippers brought to their encounters with the divine, remained difficult to reconstruct from the available evidence. which consisted largely of institutional texts, mythological narratives, and ritual prescriptions rather than personal testimonies of spiritual experience. The hymns and prayers that had survived suggested attitudes of awe, gratitude, supplication, and fear, the recognition of human dependence on divine powers whose motives and intentions could not always be understood, but whose favour was essential for the continuation of individual and collective existence. The penitential psalms that Mesopotamian worshippers had composed when afflicted by illness or misfortune revealed a religious sensibility in which suffering was understood as evidence of divine displeasure, though the specific transgression that had occasioned the god's anger might remain unknown to the sufferer, who appealed for mercy and restoration without necessarily knowing what sin required expiation. The personal gods and goddesses whom individual Mesopotamians cultivated as their particular patrons and protectors had provided a more intimate dimension of religious experience than the great cosmic deities of the state cult, intermediaries who could advocate for their human charges before the assembly of the greater gods, and who received offerings and devotions in household shrines, as well as in the great temples of the cities. The religious life of ancient Mesopotamia had thus operated on multiple scales simultaneously, from the grand rituals of the state cult that celebrated the powers responsible for cosmic order, to the personal devotions that individual worshippers offered to the deities they believed watched over their particular lives and fortunes. The festivals that had marked the sacred calendar of ancient Mesopotamian cities had provided occasions when the entire community participated in celebrations of divine power and presence, occasions when the normal routines of daily life gave way to processions, offerings, feasting, and ritual drama that enacted the great myths of creation, conflict, and renewal. The Akitu festival that Babylon celebrated at the New Year had brought the entire city into participation in rituals that renewed the cosmic order, re-established the kingship under divine sanction, and celebrated the triumph of Marduk over the forces of chaos that threatened the world's stability. The procession of the god statue from the great temple of Esagila through the Ishtar Gate and along the ceremonial way to the Akitu house had transformed the urban landscape into a sacred theatre in which the relationship between the divine patron and his human servants was publicly performed and renewed. The texts that prescribed the rituals to be performed during the festival had specified not only the actions and offerings required, but the prayers and recitations that accompanied them, creating a complex liturgical program that professional priests executed over the 11 days of the celebration. The king's participation in these rituals had been essential, his temporary humiliation before the god and his subsequent reinvestiture with royal authority dramatically enacting the principle that earthly power derived from divine delegation and required periodic renewal through ritual submission to the divine source of all legitimate authority. The festival had thus served political as well as religious functions, reinforcing the ideology of kingship while providing occasions for public celebration that strengthened social cohesion and communal identity. The gradual fading of these festivals and the religious life they embodied had occurred not through sudden cataclysm but through the slow accumulation of changes that transformed the cultural landscape of the ancient Near East over centuries of shifting political circumstances and evolving religious sensibilities. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE had not immediately disrupted the traditional worship of the Mesopotamian gods, as the Achaemenid rulers had generally pursued policies of religious toleration that permitted subject peoples to maintain their traditional cults under Persian imperial authority. Cyrus the Great had presented himself as the chosen instrument of Marduk, selected by the god to liberate Babylon from the impious rule of Nabonidus, and the cylinder inscription that commemorated his conquest had employed the traditional language of Mesopotamian royal ideology to legitimize Persian rule to Babylonian audiences. The temples had continued to function, the festivals had continued to be celebrated, and the scribal schools had continued to transmit the traditional learning that included the mythological narratives and ritual prescriptions of Mesopotamian religious practice. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's conquest had introduced new cultural influences and new ruling elites, but the traditional Mesopotamian cults had persisted alongside the Greek religious practices that the Seleucid rulers and their Macedonian and Greek settlers brought with them. The astronomical observations that Babylonian priests continued to record on cuneiform tablets had served both traditional religious purposes and the mathematical astronomy that Greek and later Arabic scientists would draw upon in their own investigations of celestial phenomena. The Parthian period had witnessed the continued functioning of traditional Mesopotamian temples, though the evidence for religious practice became increasingly fragmentary as the centuries passed and the cultural traditions that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization gradually lost their vitality under the pressure of competing religious systems and changing social circumstances. The latest cuneiform tablets that could be dated with certainty belonged to the 1st century of the Common Era, astronomical observations recorded by the last generation of priests who still possessed the technical knowledge required to read and write the ancient scripts. The temples that had served the Anunnaki for more than 3,000 years had fallen into disrepair and eventual ruin, their mud brick structures gradually dissolving back into the alluvial plain from which they had risen, leaving only the massive cores of the ziggurats to mark the locations where the gods had once received the worship of their human servants. The cities that had been the centres of Mesopotamian civilization had declined in population and eventually been abandoned entirely, their streets and houses and administrative buildings buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris until only mounds rising from the plain indicated where once had stood Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, and the other great urban centres of the ancient Near East. The languages in which the Anunnaki had been named and praised had ceased to be spoken, Sumerian having died as a vernacular tongue by the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, though continuing as a learned language for another 2,000 years, Akkadian persisting longer, but eventually giving way to Aramaic and other Semitic languages that became the common speech of the region under Persian and later rule. The scripts in which the sacred text had been written had become illegible, the cuneiform wedges that had recorded the names and attributes of the gods becoming merely mysterious markings that no living person could read or understand. The Anunnaki had passed from living religious tradition into the oblivion that awaited all gods whose worshippers had ceased to perform the rituals and make the offerings that sustained divine power in the world of human experience. The centuries during which the Anunnaki remained forgotten had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the spread of new religions, and the transformation of the ancient Near East from the cradle of civilization into a peripheral region of the great empires that successively dominated the Mediterranean and Western Asian worlds. The Romans had passed through Mesopotamia without paying particular attention to the ruined mounds that marked the locations of vanished cities. Their interests focused on the strategic and commercial value of the region rather than its archaeological or historical significance. The Islamic conquest had brought new populations and a new religious framework to the lands where the Anunnaki had once been worshipped, though the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of the region had preserved some awareness of the ancient civilization whose remains dotted the landscape, incorporating legendary memories of Babylon and its builders into their own cultural traditions. The Jewish community that had remained in Iraq since the Babylonian exile had maintained scriptural memories of Nebuchadnezzar and the great city that had held their ancestors captive, memories that preserved the name of Babylon as a symbol of earthly power and impiety, even as the actual city crumbled into ruin. The Christian and later Muslim scholars who speculated about the ancient past had little access to direct evidence about the nature of the gods the ancient Mesopotamians had worshipped, their knowledge limited to the fragmentary and often hostile accounts preserved in biblical texts and classical sources that describe the religions of Babylon and Assyria from the perspectives of outsiders who had regarded these traditions as examples of paganism to be condemned rather than systems of belief to be understood on their own terms. The rediscovery of the ancient Mesopotamian past, beginning in the 19th century with the archaeological excavations and linguistic breakthroughs that revealed the content of the cuneiform tablets, had thus represented a genuine recovery of lost knowledge rather than the continuation of an unbroken tradition of memory and transmission. The scholars who first deciphered the cuneiform scripts and translated the texts that contained the names and myths of the Anunnaki had been encountering material that no human being had been able to read for nearly 2,000 years, material that revealed a religious world entirely different from the biblical and classical sources that had previously shaped Western understanding of the ancient Near East. The discovery that the biblical flood narrative had Mesopotamian antecedents, that the creation accounts of Genesis showed affinities with Babylonian cosmogonic myths, that the figure of Gilgamesh had sought immortality in ways that resonated with biblical themes of human limitation and divine transcendence, had transformed scholarly understanding of the relationships between ancient Near Eastern cultures and the biblical traditions that emerged from their midst. The Anunnaki had thus re-entered human awareness not as living objects of worship, but as subjects of scholarly investigation, figures whose significance lay in what they revealed about the development of human religious thought and the cultural context from which the biblical traditions had emerged. The physical remains of the civilization that had worshipped the Anunnaki continued to stand as monuments to the religious life of the ancient Near East, their presence on the Iraqi landscape connecting the contemporary world to the distant past through material continuity rather than cultural memory. The ziggurat of Ur, partially restored in the 20th century by archaeologists who had excavated its buried lower stages, rose from the plain as a visible reminder of the scale and ambition of ancient Mesopotamian temple construction, its stepped profile recreating something of the impression that the original structure must have made on worshippers approaching the sacred precinct where the moon god Inanna received the devotion of the city's inhabitants. The ruins of Babylon, their mud brick structures far more eroded than the baked brick constructions of Ur, still marked the location where Marduk's great temple Esagila had stood, and where the Ishtar Gate had opened onto the processional way that led to the Akitu House, though the reconstruction of the gate in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin provided a more vivid impression of its original appearance than the fragmentary remains that survived on site. The archaeological sites that dotted the Iraqi landscape from the marshes of the south to the Assyrian heartland in the north contained the accumulated evidence of millennia of religious practice, temple foundations and ritual objects, and inscribed tablets that documented the worship of the Anunnaki across the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization. The preservation of these sites, threatened by the combined pressures of agricultural development, looting, armed conflict and climate change, remained a matter of international concern. The recognition that the evidence they contained for human religious and cultural history represented an irreplaceable resource for understanding the ancient past. The tablets that had been excavated and transported to museums around the world constituted the primary sources through which scholarly understanding of the Anunnaki continued to develop, their cuneiform texts offering direct access to the ways the ancient Mesopotamians had conceived and represented their gods. The mythological narratives that recounted the creation of the world, the ordering of civilization, the descent of Inanna to the underworld, and the great flood that had threatened to destroy humanity continued to yield new insights, as advances in philological method enabled scholars to read damaged passages, resolve ambiguous terms, and understand cultural context that had eluded earlier interpreters. The ritual texts that prescribed the offerings and ceremonies appropriate to each deity, the hymns that praised divine attributes and sought divine favour, the omen literature that revealed how the gods communicated their intentions through signs in the natural and social worlds, all contributed to an increasingly detailed understanding of how the religious life of ancient Mesopotamia had actually functioned. The administrative archives of temples and palaces, documenting the economic operations that supported religious institutions, and the bureaucratic procedures through which cultic activities were organised and controlled, provided evidence for the social and institutional dimensions of Mesopotamian religion that complemented the theological and mythological information preserved in the literary texts. The scholarly enterprise of Mesopotamian studies, drawing on archaeological, philological, historical and anthropological methods, continued to advance the project of recovering and interpreting the religious heritage that the Anunnaki represented. The endurance of ancient Mesopotamian religious themes in later religious and cultural traditions suggested that the influence of the Anunnaki had extended beyond the historical boundaries of Mesopotamian civilization, persisting in transformed and often unrecognized forms in the religious systems that succeeded and replaced the original cults. The biblical traditions that had emerged from the cultural world of the ancient Near East carried within them echoes of Mesopotamian themes and motifs that scholars continued to identify and analyze. From the flood narrative that preserved the basic structure of its Mesopotamian antecedents, to the creation accounts that engaged with cosmogonic questions that Mesopotamian mythology had previously addressed. The Jewish and Christian traditions that developed from these biblical foundations had thus incorporated, however indirectly, elements of the religious thought that the Anunnaki had embodied, transmitting through time cultural material whose ultimate origins lay in the temples and scribal schools of ancient Sumer and Babylon. The Gnostic movements of late antiquity had drawn more directly on Mesopotamian religious traditions, incorporating figures and themes from the ancient Near Eastern heritage into their elaborate mythological systems in ways that scholars continued to trace and document. The Islamic civilization that had succeeded to the cultural territory of ancient Mesopotamia had preserved and transmitted astronomical, mathematical, and philosophical knowledge that descended ultimately from Babylonian sources, maintaining threads of intellectual continuity that connected the medieval Islamic world to the ancient civilization whose ruins lay beneath the streets of Baghdad and the surrounding countryside. The contemporary moment in which the Anunnaki existed simultaneously as objects of scholarly investigation, figures of popular imagination, and subjects of alternative belief represented only the latest phase in the long afterlife of these ancient gods, a phase whose ultimate significance could not yet be determined by observers positioned within it, rather than at some future vantage point from which its outcomes might be assessed. The continuing excavation and publication of cuneiform texts promised future discoveries that might transform scholarly understanding in ways that could not presently be anticipated, just as the decipherment of the Gilgamesh epic had transformed 19th century understanding of the relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. The development of new technologies for imaging, analysing and interpreting ancient materials offered possibilities for extracting information from tablets and monuments that previous generations had been unable to perceive, expanding the evidential base from which scholarly conclusions could be drawn. The growing recognition of the importance of Mesopotamian contributions to human cultural development, from the invention of writing to the development of mathematical astronomy, ensured that the civilization that had worshipped the Anunnaki would continue to receive scholarly attention commensurate with its historical significance. The questions that drove this scholarly enterprise, questions about the nature of ancient religious experience, the development of human civilization, and the relationships between the cultures of the ancient Near East and the traditions that emerged from them, ensured that the Anunnaki would remain subjects of serious intellectual inquiry for as long as scholars continued to investigate the ancient past. The ruins that stood on the Iraqi plain, eroded by time and weather, damaged by conflict and neglect, remained nevertheless the most eloquent witnesses to the religious world that the Anunnaki had inhabited, physical presences that connected the contemporary moment to the ancient past through their mere existence as surviving fragments of vanished structures. The ziggurat of Akar-Kuf, visible from Baghdad, its weathered core rising from the suburban sprawl that surrounded it, testified to the ambition and resources that ancient Mesopotamian civilization had devoted to the construction of temples worthy of the gods, even as its current condition testified equally to the destructive power of time and the difficulty of preserving mud brick constructions against the forces of erosion and decay. The mounds that marked the locations of ancient cities throughout southern Iraq concealed beneath their surfaces the accumulated debris of millennia of human habitation, the temples and houses and workshops and streets that had constituted the physical settings of ancient Mesopotamian life, waiting for future excavators to reveal their remains and interpret their significance. The marshes of the south, where the Tigris and Euphrates approached their confluence with the Persian Gulf, preserved environmental conditions not entirely unlike those that had existed when the first cities arose in this region, reed beds and waterways that recalled the primordial circumstances from which Mesopotamian civilization had emerged, and to which its religious imagery had repeatedly returned in characterizing the state of the world before the gods had imposed order on chaos. The landscape itself thus served as a kind of monument to the Anunnaki, the physical setting that had shaped the religious imagination of the civilization that had worshipped them, and that continued to offer evidence for understanding their place in ancient Mesopotamian thought. The silence that now surrounded these monuments, the absence of the prayers and hymns and ritual recitations that had once filled the sacred precincts with human voices raised in praise and supplication of the divine, marked the fundamental discontinuity between the ancient religious life and its modern study. No priest performed rituals at the base of the ziggurat of Ur, no worshippers brought offerings to the shrines of Inanna at Uruk, no scribes copied the sacred texts that preserved the mythological narratives and ritual prescriptions of the ancient cult. The gods who had once received the constant attention of dedicated personnel now stood in museum galleries as objects of aesthetic appreciation and scholarly analysis, their stone and bronze forms divorced from the cultic context that had given them meaning and the ritual activities that had sustained their power. The tablets that had recorded the words addressed to these gods now rested in climate-controlled storage facilities, their cuneiform texts available for examination by specialists but no longer serving the religious purposes for which they had originally been composed. The silence was the silence of gods who had ceased to be worshipped, whose names and attributes survived only because the materials on which they had been recorded had proved more durable than the religious traditions that had created them. Yet this silence was not absolute, for the Anunnaki continued to speak through the texts that had preserved their stories, their voices accessible to anyone willing to undertake the labour of learning the languages and scripts in which they had been recorded. The mythological narratives that recounted the creation of the world, the fashioning of humanity, the descent to the underworld, and the Great Flood continue to offer access to religious thought of remarkable sophistication and power, thought that had grappled with fundamental questions about cosmic order, divine justice, human mortality, and the relationship between gods and mortals in ways that remained compelling to modern readers willing to engage with them on their own terms. The hymns that had praised the attributes of the gods continued to convey something of the awe and devotion that worshippers had felt in the presence of divine power, their elaborate imagery and emotional intensity transcending the cultural distance that separated ancient Mesopotamia from the contemporary world. The scholarly project of interpreting these texts, of recovering as fully as possible the meanings they had held for their original audiences, remained a vital enterprise that connected the present to the past through the patient labour of reading and understanding. The Anunnaki might no longer receive worship, but they continued to command attention, their surviving testimonies offering evidence for understanding how ancient human beings had conceived their place in a cosmos they believed to be populated by divine powers whose favour was essential for the continuation of individual and collective existence. The final image of the Anunnaki that emerged from this long journey through their history and afterlife was neither the cosmic ancestors of alternative belief nor the mere superstitions of rationalist dismissal, but something more complex and more interesting than either characterization suggested. They had been the gods of a civilization that had invented writing, developed mathematics and astronomy to remarkable levels of sophistication, created literary works of enduring power and beauty, and organized social and political life according to principles that influenced subsequent civilizations throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. They had represented the sacred dimension of a world that had not yet learned to distinguish rigidly between natural and supernatural, a world in which divine agency pervaded all aspects of existence, and in which the maintenance of proper relationships between human and divine realms constituted the essential task of religious life. They had embodied the values and anxieties of the civilization that worshipped them, its sense of human dependence on forces beyond human control, its understanding of cosmic order as something requiring constant ritual maintenance, its recognition of human mortality as the fundamental condition distinguishing gods from mortals. They had been, in short, the gods appropriate to the civilization that had created them, expressions of human religious imagination responding to the particular circumstances of life in the alluvial plain between the rivers where the world's first cities had arisen. The ziggurats that still rose from the Iraqi desert, diminished by time but not yet entirely erased, stood as the last physical monuments to these gods and the civilization that had worshipped them, their stepped profiles silhouetted against skies that ancient astronomers had watched for signs of divine intention. The tablets that rested in museums from Baghdad to Berlin to Philadelphia preserved in their cuneiform inscriptions the names and stories of deities whose worship had ended more than 2,000 years ago, but whose significance for understanding human religious history continued to command scholarly attention. The Anunnaki, those princely offspring of heaven and earth, had shaped the religious imagination of the ancient Near East across 3 millennia of continuous tradition before passing into the long silence from which 19th century scholarship had partially recovered them, and their story remained one of the foundational chapters in the larger narrative of how human beings had conceived their relationship with powers they believed to transcend the ordinary limits of mortal existence, powers they had named and praised and served in the confident expectation that such devotion would be noticed and rewarded by the divine beings who ruled the cosmos from their temples on the Mesopotamian plain.